Hello, my fellow story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. This tale takes us to a small, almost forgotten factory on the outskirts of a quiet town. It had been around for decades, a staple in the community, providing jobs to a large number of families. On the surface, everything seemed perfectly normal. The workers came and went, just as you would expect. They punched in, did their shifts, and returned home at the end of the day. There was nothing unusual about the place. Nothing that would raise suspicion in the hearts of its employees, and yet something was undeniably wrong. I know this story well because I worked at this factory for several years. I remember those first few months as if they were yesterday. The long, clanking sounds of machines, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the chatter of coworkers filling the air during breaks. It was the kind of place where you didn't expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. Nothing to make you jump out of your skin, nothing to give you that gut-wrenching feeling that you were being watched. The factory was old, a sprawling structure with high ceilings and long hallways that seemed to go on forever. The floors were worn, the paint chipped away in places, but it had its charm. A place where the days stretched on, filled with routines that offered comfort to those of us who spent hours there. And like any factory, it had its fair share of people, managers, supervisors, and laborers, all just doing their part to keep things running smoothly. But the one person who stands out most in my memory, especially in the days leading up to the strange events, was Tom. He had been there longer than anyone, a steady presence with a gruff demeanor. Tom knew everything about the factory. He'd worked in nearly every department, from maintenance to the assembly line. If you ever had a question about the place, you went to Tom. He had seen it all and knew how to fix just about anything. Then there was Kelly, a newer recruit, someone who had joined the factory only a few months before I did. She was friendly and eager, always quick with a smile and a laugh. You couldn't help but like her. She'd often sit with the rest of us in the break room, chatting about her life outside of work. But something about Kelly was different. She had an unnerving curiosity about the factory, always asking questions about its history and the people who had worked there before. She would linger near the old boiler room, staring at it as though she could feel something emanating from within. These people, Tom and Kelly, were my companions in those early days. We spent our shifts together, day in and day out. The factory was a steady rhythm, one that became a predictable backdrop to our lives. There were the usual gripes about the heat or the noise, but for the most part, the place felt safe. Comfortable, even. But over time, that feeling of safety began to slip away. Something started to change, though at first, none of us could pinpoint exactly what it was. We had no reason to question the factory. After all, we were all just trying to do our jobs, to get by. It wasn't until the first disappearance that we started to notice the cracks in the facade. It was a slow unraveling, at first subtle enough to dismiss, but when you took a moment to reflect on it, you couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until a late shift, when I stayed after hours to catch up on some work, that I first felt the eerie sensation that something was wrong. The factory, usually loud and bustling with activity, had grown unnervingly quiet. The sounds of machinery clanking against metal had softened, almost as if they were muffled by an invisible force. I looked around at the rows of machines, feeling a chill creep up my spine as the silence settled around me. At that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that massive factory anymore. But it wasn't until later, when we all returned after the weekend, that we would learn how true that feeling was. And that's when the disappearances began. People started vanishing without a trace. First, it was small, easy to overlook someone called in sick, or perhaps they just left early without notice. But then it escalated. Whole shifts began to disappear, workers vanishing during the middle of their hours, with no one ever seeing them again. Tom, the veteran, was the first to notice. He'd been around long enough to sense when things were off. I remember sitting with him one evening after everyone had left for the day, discussing how strange it was that so many people were suddenly missing. "Something's wrong here," he said, his voice low and heavy with a sense of dread I hadn't seen in him before. "I've worked in this place long enough to know when it's not right. You can feel it, can't you?" I didn't know what he meant at first, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized he was right. There was something in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As the days went on, the strange disappearances became impossible to ignore. No one seemed to know what was happening or why people were disappearing. The factory, once a place of mundane routine, was now filled with whispers and uneasy glances. The workers grew quiet, fearful of what they might encounter during their shifts. There was one more thing that made the situation all the more eerie. The factory had no records of the missing people. No one knew where they had gone, why they hadn't shown up for their shifts, or where they had disappeared to. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. No one knew what to do. The factory management was tight-lipped, unwilling to offer any explanation. Some of us considered going to the police, but no one was brave enough to take that step. After all, how could you explain something as absurd as employees vanishing into thin air without a single trace? Tom was the first to say it out loud, the words that no one else dared speak. "This place is cursed." It was hard to argue with him after all that had happened, but none of us wanted to admit it. We were trapped, each of us unsure if we would be the next to vanish without a trace. And so, the factory continued to hum with its eerie quiet, and the disappearances continued one by one, each more baffling than the last. What was happening at that factory? Was it something supernatural? A series of strange coincidences? Or was there something more sinister at play? No one could say for sure. But I can tell you this, things would only get worse from here. The eerie silence would deepen, and the truth, whatever it was, would be harder to ignore. And as the days passed, I began to wonder if anyone would ever leave that factory again. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I first noticed something was wrong. The day had started out just like any other, mundane, repetitive, and oddly comforting in its predictability. The factory buzzed with the usual sounds, the machines clattering, the workers talking, the footsteps echoing through the long corridors. The air was thick with the scent of oil, metal, and machinery, nothing that would suggest that the place had any secrets hidden within it. Yet, even on that ordinary day, there was something in the air, a slight unease that I couldn't shake. It was during the afternoon break when it first happened. I was sitting with Tom and Kelly in the break room, the small space filled with the low murmur of other workers eating their lunch. We had our usual banter jokes about the latest workplace gossip, complaints about the heat, and half-hearted discussions about the local news. But there was an odd feeling in the room that day. Something wasn't quite right. It started with the lights. At first, it was a small flicker, just enough to make you second-guess whether you saw it. But as the conversation continued, the flickering intensified. The overhead fluorescent lights above us blinked erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls and making the room feel colder than it actually was. At first, we all ignored it. It wasn't anything unusual. These lights had a habit of doing that every now and then. But then it got worse. The flickering grew more pronounced, and the buzzing sound that came with it seemed to get louder. It wasn't the usual hum you'd hear when the lights malfunctioned. This was different. It was almost as if the lights were struggling, like something was pulling them in and out of focus. Tom, always the practical one, glanced up and muttered under his breath, "That's weird. Never heard them do that before." Kelly didn't seem to notice at first. She was busy unwrapping her sandwich, too absorbed in her lunch to pay attention to the malfunctioning lights. But when Tom said something, she looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she followed his gaze. Her mouth closed in mid-bite, and she chewed slowly as she stared at the ceiling. "Yeah, that's strange," she said, her voice laced with uncertainty. "Maybe we should tell maintenance." I didn't want to overreact, but something about the way the lights were flickering made my stomach churn. I could almost feel a weight in the room, a heaviness that wasn't there before. It was like something was lingering in the air, just out of reach, but close enough for you to sense it. "Let's just finish our break and tell someone after," I suggested, trying to brush off the unease that was slowly creeping up my spine. But just as I said that, the lights went out completely, plunging the break room into darkness. The sudden silence was deafening. I could hear my own breath as I fumbled for my phone to turn on the flashlight. It was as if the factory itself had swallowed the sound of the world around us. "Okay, that's not normal," Kelly said, her voice now tinged with concern. "This is seriously weird." I heard Tom stand up from his seat, his boots thudding on the concrete floor. "Let me check the fuse box," he said, his tone steady, but his words betraying a hint of irritation. He wasn't one to get rattled easily, but even he could tell something wasn't right. He moved quickly toward the door, but before he could reach it, the lights flickered back on. This time, they didn't just return to normal. They were bright, too bright. It was almost as if someone had turned up the intensity. For a moment, it felt like the room was engulfed in an unnatural light, almost blinding in its intensity. The sudden burst of brightness didn't last long, though. Within seconds, the lights dimmed again, and a cold draft swept through the room, carrying with it a strange metallic smell. Tom froze in place, his hand still on the doorframe. Kelly and I exchanged uneasy glances. Neither of us knew what to make of it. This was no simple malfunction. "That's it," Kelly said, her voice tight with uncertainty. "I'm going to talk to someone about this. There's something wrong with this place." Before we could say anything more, the door to the break room opened with a soft creak. It was a sound I had heard 1,000 times before, but this time it was different. It was too quiet, too deliberate. A chill ran through me as I turned to see who was entering. It was one of the night shift workers, Henry. He was always the last to arrive, dragging himself in just as everyone else was finishing up for the day. Henry had a reputation for being a little off. He kept to himself, never really engaging with the rest of us. There were whispers that he had been working at the factory for too long, and that something about the place had gotten to him over the years. But today, as he stepped into the room, he looked different. His usually dull eyes were wide open, his face pale as if he hadn't seen the light of day in far too long. He was breathing heavily, as though he had just run a marathon. "Hey, Henry," I greeted him, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. "Everything okay?" He didn't respond right away. He just stood there in the doorway, his eyes darting around the room as if he were looking for something or someone. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. They're coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible, like he was afraid of being overheard. "They're not gone. They're still here." His words hit me like a cold slap across the face. Kelly looked at me, her expression confused, and I could see the same unease mirrored in her eyes. Tom took a step forward, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean, Henry? Who's still here?" Henry's eyes flicked to the corner of the room, as if he were seeing something we couldn't. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he backed up, his body stiff and jerky, as if he were being pulled by some invisible force. His breath grew shallow, ragged, and then, in a voice filled with pure fear, he muttered again. "They're in the walls. You can't leave. They won't let you leave." Before we could ask any more questions, Henry turned and bolted from the room, his footsteps echoing through the factory as he disappeared into the hall. A heavy silence fell over us as we stood there, staring at the door Henry had just slammed shut. The buzzing of the lights, which had started again, was the only sound that filled the air, and it felt louder than before, almost oppressive. Tom broke the silence first. Did he really just say that?" Kelly shook her head, her face pale. "I don't know, but that was insane." I didn't have an explanation for what we'd just witnessed. Henry's behavior was bizarre, to say the least, but it was his words that rattled me the most. there in the walls? What did that even mean? We all stood there for a long while, lost in our thoughts. No one spoke, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. The lights flickered again, and this time, no one even bothered to look up. We had all seen enough to know that something wasn't right. We couldn't deny it any longer. It was no longer just the lights. It was the strange words from Henry, the unease that had settled into the bones of the factory, the palpable tension that felt like it was suffocating us. It was clear now something was wrong. The next few days at the factory were strange, to say the least. What started as a small flicker of lights, a hint of unease in the air, quickly spiraled into something far more unsettling. At first, it seemed like a random series of odd occurrences, nothing too major to cause alarm, but enough to make you question your sense of reality. It was like the building itself was trying to warn us, its pulse quickening with every passing moment. Tom was the first to notice it. He always had a keen sense for things that were off. It started with small things, like the sounds that echoed through the hallways. The factory was large, and the constant hum of machines often drowned out the other noises. But now there was something else, a low, rumbling sound, like distant machinery or an underground engine. It wasn't the usual sounds of the factory, and it seemed to shift locations, never quite staying in one place long enough to be pinpointed. I remember one afternoon, Tom called me over to the maintenance area, where he'd been working on a piece of equipment. He looked more shaken than usual. "Listen," he said, his voice tight with concern. We stood there for a moment in the stillness, and there it was again, the deep, rumbling noise. But it wasn't coming from the machines. It was coming from the walls. I pressed my ear to the cold metal of the wall, and for a moment, I thought I heard something. It was faint, but it almost sounded like breathing. But no one was there. No one was close enough to make such a sound. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his eyes wide, but he didn't say anything. He simply turned and walked toward the exit of the room, his hands trembling as he wiped them on his pants. I followed him, the strange noise lingering in my mind, refusing to leave. The next day, the occurrences escalated even further. The lights flickered constantly now, never quite settling. The temperature in certain areas of the factory dropped sharply, and it didn't matter how many space heaters were brought in, it was as though the cold was coming from the very walls themselves. We moved through the factory, our movements now hurried and tense, but the further we went, the stranger things became. During the late shift, Kelly and I were assigned to inspect some of the old machinery in the farthest corner of the building. The area was dimly lit, and the air felt thick with dust. It was the type of space where people rarely went out of sight, out of mind. But as we stood there, inspecting the machines, something caught my eye. At first, it was just a shape, an indistinct shadow that moved against the wall. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a trick of the light. But then, I saw it again. This time, it was more distinct. A figure, tall and thin, darted across the far end of the room, disappearing into the shadows. My heart raced. "Kelly," I whispered urgently, my voice tight with panic. "Did you see that?" She turned to me, her eyes wide with confusion. "See what?" The figure. There, in the corner." Kelly's face paled, and she shook her head slowly. "No, there's nothing there." I felt a cold chill slide down my spine, but I didn't want to be the one to sound crazy. I forced myself to look again, but the corner was empty. My mind must have been playing tricks on me, I thought. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was a reflection or the shadows cast by the machines. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew deep down that something wasn't right. Later that night, as we walked back to the break room, Kelly and I kept our voices low, our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The factory was quieter now, with only a few people remaining on the night shift, but the silence felt heavy, oppressive. It was like the building itself was holding its breath. "We need to get out of here," Kelly said suddenly, her voice sharp with fear. "Something's not right, and I'm not sticking around to find out what." I couldn't argue with her. The air in the factory felt thick, and I could still hear that faint, rumbling noise, a low hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It was as if the walls themselves were alive. We passed the same stretch of hallway we had just walked through earlier, but now it felt different. The shadows were deeper, more menacing. The light from the overhead bulbs flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the walls that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. It was then that we saw it. In the distance, standing just outside the maintenance area, was Henry. His figure was barely visible in the dim light, his form hunched and distorted. He was just standing there, staring at us. There was no sign of recognition in his eyes, no greeting, just a cold, empty stare. It was as if he was waiting for something or someone. "Henry?" I called out hesitantly, my voice barely breaking through the silence. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His eyes remained fixed on us, unwavering. I stepped closer, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of the scene. But as I did, the lights overhead flickered again this time, not just a flicker, but a full-blown strobe effect. The walls seemed to close in around me, the lights flashing like an oncoming storm. I could feel the tension building in the air, as if the whole place were about to collapse. And then, in an instant, Henry was gone. He didn't walk away. He didn't turn around. One moment he was standing there, and the next, he vanished. I blinked, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. "What the hell?" Kelly muttered under her breath. We both stood frozen for a moment, the only sound the pounding of our hearts. Then, without another word, we turned and hurried back to the break room, the echo of our footsteps, the only thing that accompanied us. That night, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Every corner we turned, every hallway we passed, the shadows seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. The temperature dropped again, a biting chill creeping into our bones. I swear, I could feel eyes on me, as if someone or something was watching from the dark corners of the factory. The strange noises were no longer sporadic. They were constant now, a steady hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls, the floors, the very air around us. The walls themselves seemed to groan, like an old house is settling, but there was something wrong about it. Something unnatural. We tried to keep our focus on our work, but it was hard. Every time I turned my back, I felt as if the walls were closing in, that something was just beyond my reach, waiting. And yet, no matter how many times we checked, nothing seemed to make sense. There was no clear explanation for what was happening. By the end of the week, the factory had become a place of dread, a place where every creak, every flicker of light, every unexplained noise sent us further down a rabbit hole of fear. It was as if the place itself were alive, and not in a way that could be easily explained. There was no doubt in my mind now. Something was happening here, something that none of us understood. The factory had become a place of constant tension. Every corner felt as though it was watching us, every flicker of light an omen. We were no longer going through our daily routines in the same way. The factory, which had once been a second home to us, now seemed like a place where the very air was thick with something we couldn't explain. The strange noises, the cold spots, the flickering lights, they were becoming harder to ignore. And then, one night, things escalated beyond anything any of us could have imagined. It was a Friday evening, the last shift of the week. Tom, Kelly, and I were assigned to clean up the production floor. It was quiet, too quiet. Most of the staff had gone home for the night, leaving only a few of us behind to handle the end-of-week duties. But as we walked through the long, sterile hallways, it was hard to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The usual sounds of machinery were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that stretched on, pressing in around us. We had finished the majority of our work by midnight. The factory floor was spotless, the machines powered off, and everything seemed still. But then, it happened. The lights above us flickered, casting long shadows on the floor. But they didn't flicker as they usually did. This time, they went out completely. The entire floor was plunged into darkness, and the low hum of the factory that we had grown accustomed to fell silent. Great. Just great, Kelly muttered, pulling out her flashlight. I knew this was going to happen. We all stood there in the dark for a moment, trying to adjust. The beam of Kelly's flashlight cut through the blackness, revealing only the faintest outline of the machines in front of us. And then, from the silence, a voice broke through. It wasn't loud at first, but it was unmistakable, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The words were faint, almost like a murmur, but the tone was clear. It wasn't human. Help me. We all froze. Our hearts skipped a beat, and for a moment, none of us could move. The voice was so unnatural, so distant, yet so close at the same time. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl, like the words were scratching at the inside of your brain. It wasn't the voice of anyone we knew. Did you hear that? Tom whispered, his breath catching in his throat. He was staring into the dark, his flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. I heard it, Kelly said, her voice barely a whisper. She sounded just as terrified as I felt. What the hell was that? Before any of us could say anything else, the factory lights flickered back on, much more violently this time. The sudden brightness was blinding after the darkness, but it only took a second for us to realize what had happened. The floor was empty. The machines were still powered down, and there was no sign of anyone. But the strange feeling that had lingered in the air for weeks was now unmistakable. It felt as though something had shifted. Something was here with us. We stood in stunned silence, our eyes scanning the floor. The noise, the voice, it didn't make sense. But just as quickly as the lights came back on, they flickered again, this time leaving us in complete darkness. Not again, I heard Kelly say under her breath, her voice tight with fear. I felt my stomach tighten. Something was wrong. Something was horribly wrong. And then it happened. The floor beneath our feet trembled slightly. It was almost imperceptible at first, but it quickly grew stronger, the rumble vibrating through the concrete. The walls groaned as if they were alive, and the temperature dropped so quickly it took my breath away. The air had shifted, becoming colder, heavier. I shivered involuntarily. Did you feel that? I asked, my voice shaky. I didn't need to see their faces to know that they felt it too, the fear, the dread that seemed to seep into our very bones. Before anyone could answer, the low, rumbling noise started again. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just a hum, it was a growl, deep and guttural, coming from the heart of the factory. It echoed through the walls, vibrating the metal beams above us. We could feel the sound in our chests, a pressure that seemed to pulse with each passing second. Tom. Kelly. I whispered, unable to look away from the shadows at the far end of the room. What is that? Tom's flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. His hand was trembling so badly that the beam danced in unpredictable patterns, illuminating only brief flashes of the room. He cursed under his breath and tried to steady the light. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a shape, something moving quickly in the corner of the room, a shadow darting from one machine to the next. But as the flashlight finally steadied, we saw more details. The shape wasn't human. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long spindly limbs that seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. Its face was hidden in darkness, but we could see its eyes. Eyes that glowed with a faint, unnatural light. Run, Tom shouted, his voice rising in panic. But it was too late. The creature, whatever it was, lunged at us. The room exploded into chaos. The lights flickered again, casting rapid, disorienting flashes of light. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and a sharp, metallic scent filled my nostrils as the temperature dropped even further. I could hear Kelly screaming behind me, but I couldn't turn to look. I could only focus on running, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs aching as I sprinted toward the exit. The creature wasn't far behind us. Every time we looked back, it was closer. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, its form elongating and twisting in the flickering light. The eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, locked onto us, and I could feel a chill crawl up my spine as I realized there was nowhere to hide. There was no escape. We ran down the hallway, and just when I thought we were going to make it out, the ground beneath us shook again. The lights went out completely, and for a moment, we were plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness. I could hear nothing but my own breathing, fast and shallow. Then suddenly, a cold, icy hand gripped my arm. It was as if the creature had grabbed me from the shadows, pulling me back into the darkness. I screamed, my mind racing, but when I twisted to break free, I found nothing there, nothing but the empty hallway. "Where is it?" I gasped, panting for air. "Where did it go?" I looked around frantically. Tom and Kelly were beside me, their faces pale with fear. We didn't speak, not with words, but with our eyes. We knew this was no ordinary threat. Whatever this thing was, it was not just hunting us, it was toying with us. The rumbling sound continued, growing louder, as though it were coming from beneath the very floor we stood on. My heart pounded, my mind racing. What did it want from us? Why was it here? But as the sound grew louder, I realized there was only one answer left. There was nothing we could do. We were trapped. And just as that thought crossed my mind, the lights flickered back on. We stood in the center of the factory floor, surrounded by the now silent machines. The creature, the terror, it was gone, as if it had never been there at all. We were left standing in stunned silence, our breath ragged, our hearts still pounding in our chests. The factory was quiet again, but I knew deep down that it wouldn't stay quiet for long. The thing in the shadows was still there, and it was still waiting. It's strange how the mind works after a traumatic event. The terror we experienced in the factory that night didn't seem to dissipate with the silence that followed. It lingered in our thoughts, clouding our perception of everything. We stood there in the center of the factory floor, breathing heavily, trying to understand what had just happened. The lights flickered once more, then held steady. The machines, cold and silent, seemed to return to their dormant state. But everything felt off. The factory, which had once been a place of predictability, now seemed like a place where anything could happen. Anything at all. And we had no way of knowing what came next. "I can't do this anymore." Kelly's voice broke through the stillness. Her words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with finality. She stood a few feet away, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her body trembling. "This place, it's not right. Whatever that thing was, it's not gone. It's still here, and it will come back. I know it." Tom didn't speak at first. He was standing in the same spot where the creature had almost caught him, his face pale and drawn. He was staring at the ground, his eyes unfocused, as if he was trying to convince himself that what had happened wasn't real. But I could see the truth in his eyes, the same truth that had hit me as soon as the lights had flickered back on. We weren't safe. Not here. Not anymore. We had been spared for the moment, but the factory had changed. And we had changed with it. "I'm with Kelly," I said, my voice hoarse. It was strange how calm I felt, considering what had just happened. But my mind had already made up its decision. "I'm leaving." There was no argument, no debate. We had all seen enough. We didn't need to stay any longer to know that we were no longer welcome here. The factory that had been our livelihood, the place where we had spent so many hours working, was now a place of fear, of something we could neither explain nor escape. "I'm going to go to HR tomorrow," Kelly said, her voice a little steadier now. "I'm going to tell them everything. We can't just keep working here and pretending like everything's fine." We all knew deep down that nothing was going to change. The factory was going to deny everything. They would chalk it up to stress, to exhaustion, to overactive imaginations. And even if they did take it seriously, what could they really do? Could they even explain what had happened to us? Could they explain the growls, the shadows, the unnatural cold that had gripped the factory that night? It felt hopeless. The unanswered questions that hung in the air were suffocating, and I could feel them clawing at my chest, pushing me toward the door. We couldn't keep living with this constant fear. The three of us made our way to the exit in silence, the weight of our decisions settling in around us. We didn't look back. We couldn't. But as we reached the factory gates and stepped out into the cold night air, a strange sense of finality washed over me. It was as though the very act of leaving the factory, walking away from the source of our terror, had somehow removed the power it held over us. We were free from the factory, but we weren't free from what had happened there. In the days that followed, we never went back. I didn't even bother to return my work uniform. There was no point. The factory had already claimed too much of us. It had taken something from each of us that we could never get back. Kelly left town soon after, finding a new job somewhere far away. She was the most vocal about what had happened, and I could tell she was struggling. Tom stayed around for a little longer, but he became withdrawn, distant, as if the factory had drained him of everything that once made him. Him. As for me, I tried to return to normal life. I tried to push the memories of that night out of my head, but it was impossible. The nightmares came in waves, each one more vivid and terrifying than the last. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, the sounds of the growls echoing in my mind. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. I tried to reach out to Tom to see if he was doing any better, but he didn't respond. And Kelly? She was gone. She'd moved on, leaving me behind in a place where I couldn't move forward. I started avoiding places that reminded me of the factory dark, industrial buildings, even streetlights that flickered too much. I couldn't walk by a construction site without thinking about what we'd seen. I couldn't walk through any doors without imagining that something was lurking on the other side. The factory was never mentioned again in the small town we had all called home. People went on with their lives as though nothing had ever happened. The factory stayed open, and the machines hummed as they always had. The staff came and went, none of them the wiser. The strange disappearances were never explained. The voices never returned. The thing in the shadows was never seen again. And yet, I couldn't help but feel that it was still there, that it was still waiting for someone else to come too close. The factory was never the same, and neither were we. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel that cold air, hear the growls echoing through the halls, the voice whispering to us from the shadows. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the wind howls just right, I swear I hear a faint, almost imperceptible voice calling out, "Help me." But I'll never go back. Not to the factory. Not to those dark, empty halls. And maybe, just maybe, that's the way it was meant to be. We all left that night, but the truth is, none of us ever truly left. That place, it marked us in ways we couldn't even comprehend back then. Even now, I find myself looking over my shoulder when I'm alone, listening for sounds that don't belong. It's the kind of thing you can't just shake off. The memories linger, and no matter how far you go, there's always that nagging feeling that something, somewhere, is watching. The factory, with its towering walls and cold, lifeless machines, was a place we once thought we knew. We thought we were safe there, but in the end, it was a place where things happened that we couldn't explain, things that defied logic and reason. No one ever came forward after that night. No one talked about it. Life went on as if nothing had happened. People still went to work, still punched in their time cards, still lived their lives. But none of us could go back. None of us could pretend that it hadn't changed us. What is it about fear that lingers so long after the danger is gone? Maybe it's because we never got the answers we wanted. We were left with too many questions. Why had the lights flickered? What had that figure been, watching us from the shadows? Why did the growls echo in the halls? And why was there that sudden drop in temperature? No one can answer those questions, and maybe that's the part that bothers me the most. The not knowing, the mystery of it all. Some things just don't make sense, and no matter how much you try to make sense of them, they remain unsolved. It's like trying to catch smoke in your hand. But maybe that's the way it was meant to be. Some things are just too big for us to understand. Maybe we were never meant to know what happened in that factory or why. Maybe the world has its own rules, rules we can't see or comprehend. The kind of rules that exist in places where the light doesn't reach. I don't know if I'll ever be able to let go of what happened. I think about it more than I'd like to admit, and I wonder if Kelly or Tom ever feel the same way. I never reached out to them after they left. We all seemed to go our separate ways, each of us carrying our own version of the truth with us. But I can't help but wonder if they too hear the faint echoes of growls in the dark or feel the cold creeping up behind them. For now, I live with the knowledge that some things are beyond our understanding, that not everything can be explained or solved, and sometimes it's better that way. Because the moment we start to uncover the truth, we risk unraveling a mystery that might be better left untouched. But here's the thing. What happened at that factory, it's not just a story. It's a warning to anyone who dares to dismiss the strange things that happen around them. The things that don't fit the normal patterns, the unexplained occurrences that we so often brush aside. You can call it superstition, you can call it coincidence, but sometimes things are more than they seem. There's more to this world than meets the eye, and sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is ignore that. I've learned that the hard way, and while I'll never go back to that factory, I will always carry its lessons with me. I won't ignore the strange sounds anymore. I won't brush off the odd feelings of being watched. I won't pretend that the dark is nothing to fear, because in the end, the darkness isn't empty. It's filled with things we can't explain, things we don't fully understand. And I want to leave you with that. The next time something feels off, when you sense that something isn't right, don't ignore it. Don't push it aside because it doesn't make sense. Trust your instincts. Trust the feeling in your gut. The world is full of mysteries, and some of them are more dangerous than we ever realize. We may never get the answers we're looking for, but the search for them is what keeps us alive. As for me, I've come to terms with what happened at the factory. I've accepted that I may never know the whole truth, but I also know that the past doesn't define me. It's shaped me, yes, but it doesn't control me. I've moved on with my life as best as I can. But I'll never forget. I'll never forget the cold, the growls, the shadows that haunted those walls. They're a part of me now. So, to anyone out there who might be listening to this, I ask you, what would you do if you were faced with the same choice? If you knew that something out there didn't belong, but you couldn't explain it? Would you run? Would you fight? Or would you stay, searching for answers that may never come? The truth is, we never know what we'll do until we're faced with the unknown. And sometimes, we're better off leaving some mysteries unsolved. Now, before I let you go, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey. It was one of those evenings when everything felt just a little too normal. I had spent the day running errands, picking up groceries, and catching up on a few things around the house. You know, the usual mundane tasks that fill up your day without making a lasting impression. The kind of day where nothing really stands out, yet it sets the stage for something that will. It was late around 10 p.m. when I finally decided to call it a day. I had just finished a long phone call with a friend, and after a cup of tea, I was ready to settle into bed. That's when it all started. I'm a firm believer in the idea that the world we live in is full of ordinary moments. Life is a series of small, predictable events. We wake up, go to work, eat, sleep, and repeat. But what if one small thing in that repetitive cycle shifts and turns everything upside down? What if the comfort of your routine is suddenly disrupted by something that seems completely out of place, something that challenges your very understanding of what's real? This is where my story begins. It all started when I got a message from an unknown number. It wasn't unusual to get messages from unknown senders every now and then: spam, sales promotions, or perhaps an accidental text from someone who had the wrong number. But this message felt different. There was something about it that immediately caught my attention. It wasn't the content itself that was unsettling, but the fact that it seemed so personal. The message simply read, "I know where you are." At first, I didn't think much of it. I chalked it up to a random prank or someone who was just trying to get a reaction. But as I sat there, staring at my phone in the dim light of my bedroom, the words lingered in my mind. It was a strange feeling, one that I couldn't quite shake. I had to admit that it unsettled me. Not in a terrifying way, but in a way that made me feel exposed. It wasn't the message that scared me. It was the knowledge that someone somewhere had sent it with the intention of making me feel uneasy. I quickly dismissed it and moved on with my evening. I brushed my teeth, climbed into bed, and set my phone on the nightstand. I tried to push the thought of that message out of my mind, telling myself that I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a random prank, or perhaps someone had made a mistake. Who knows? But even as I turned off the lights and closed my eyes, the nagging feeling lingered. I kept wondering who could have sent it and why they would send such a cryptic message. The night went on, and I eventually fell into a fitful sleep. But something felt different when I woke up the next morning. The sense of normalcy I had felt before was now replaced with an odd tension. I couldn't quite explain it, but it felt as though I was being watched, though I knew no one was around. It was a strange sensation, like the air itself had changed somehow. Even though everything looked the same, something felt off. The morning unfolded in its usual rhythm. I made breakfast, checked my email, and got ready for work. But all the while, the memory of that message kept tugging at the back of my mind. Was it possible that someone was watching me? Was I just overreacting, letting my imagination run wild? The logical part of me dismissed the idea, but deep down, a small seed of doubt had been planted. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't a constant anxiety, but rather a low hum of unease that seemed to follow me wherever I went. It was during my lunch break that I decided to check my phone again. I thought maybe there would be some explanation, some reason behind that strange message. To my surprise, there was another message from the same number. This time, it was even stranger. "You haven't noticed me yet, but I'm right here." I stared at those words for a long time. Who was this person? How did they know what I was doing, where I was? The words were vague, but they seemed to suggest that someone had been observing me. But why? Who would take the time to send cryptic messages like this? I couldn't make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was just a prank. But the lack of context and the strange nature of the messages made it feel like something more than just a random joke. This felt personal, and it felt deliberate. At work, I was distracted. My colleagues must have noticed, but I was too preoccupied with what had happened. I tried to carry on as usual, but my mind kept drifting back to those messages. I started to feel a little paranoid. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, watching. But when I turned around, the world seemed perfectly ordinary. Everything was the same. Nothing had changed except for the way I saw it. As the day wound down and I returned home, I was more on edge than I had been in a long time. I kept thinking about what had happened. The strange messages, the feeling of being watched, the sense that something was off. It all added up to something I couldn't explain. And as I entered my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. That night, I sat up in bed, staring at my phone. The feeling of unease had grown stronger. And as I checked my messages one last time before I went to sleep, I saw another one. "You're not going to be able to ignore me for much longer." It was a chilling thought, one that I couldn't shake. It felt like I was being pulled into something I didn't understand, something that was beyond my control. And in that moment, I realized that the life I had always thought was so predictable and ordinary had just been changed forever. The messages weren't just a prank. They were a warning, and I had no idea what to do next. The days that followed that first strange message seemed like any other at first. My routine was largely unchanged: wake up, work, eat, sleep. On the surface, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet, The underlying sense of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach refused to go away. I tried to push the feeling aside, but the words of that first message lingered in my mind. I know where you are. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched. But life continued, as it always does. I couldn't let it consume me. I had work to do, errands to run, and responsibilities to handle. It was 2 days later when the first truly unsettling incident occurred. I had just finished a long, stressful meeting at work and was heading back to my car, trying to shake off the tension in my shoulders. It had been a challenging day, filled with tight deadlines and frustrated colleagues. I was grateful for the peace and quiet of the parking lot as I walked toward my car, relieved that I could finally leave the office behind for the day. I was lost in my thoughts, mentally preparing for the evening ahead, perhaps a quick dinner, and then some quiet time to unwind. But as I approached my car, I noticed something that immediately stopped me in my tracks. There, on the driver's side door, was a small, crumpled piece of paper wedged into the space between the window and the door frame. I could see it from a distance, and something about the sight of it immediately made my heart race. I hadn't noticed anyone around when I left the office building, and the parking lot had been mostly empty when I arrived. So how had this piece of paper gotten there? And more importantly, why had someone placed it in such a conspicuous spot? I walked over to my car slowly, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it a prank? Had I accidentally left something important in my car and someone was trying to get my attention? My fingers trembled as I reached for the paper, half expecting to find something ridiculous, perhaps a coupon or some kind of ad. But when I unfolded the paper, my stomach dropped. The note wasn't a coupon. It was a short, cryptic message, written in hurried, almost scrawled handwriting. I've been watching you for days. You don't know me, but I know you. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring at the words. The shock of seeing them, written in such an intimate and unsettling way, made my breath catch in my throat. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, suddenly became all too real. The note felt like a confirmation of everything I had been trying to ignore, a tangible piece of evidence that someone, somewhere, had been tracking my every move. It was as though they had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. I glanced around the parking lot, but it was empty. No one was in sight. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it have been someone from work? A coworker playing a prank? Or was it someone else entirely, someone I didn't even know? It felt too personal to be a random joke. There was a deliberate intent behind the message, and that's what frightened me the most. I crumpled the note in my hand, my fingers tight around it, and threw it in the nearest trash bin. I tried to shake off the panic that was rising in my chest, but it lingered, like a shadow following me as I climbed into my car. I started the engine, my hand shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The whole drive home felt surreal, as though the world around me was somehow altered. Every turn, every stop, felt amplified. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. When I arrived home, I immediately locked the door behind me. I don't know why, but I felt an overwhelming need to make sure I was safe. I turned on all the lights in the house, checking every window and door. I felt like I was on edge, as if I was being hunted by something invisible, something that could strike at any moment. But there was no sign of anyone, just the empty, familiar silence of my home. I tried to dismiss the incident as an isolated event. It could have been a prank, right? People do strange things sometimes, and maybe someone had a sixth sense of humor. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That note didn't feel random. It felt too precise, too purposeful. Whoever had left it there knew exactly what they were doing. I tried to distract myself that evening, watching a movie to take my mind off the unsettling experience. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was the same sensation I had felt earlier in the day, but now it was stronger. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see someone standing outside, watching me. But no one was there. It was after midnight when I finally decided to go to bed. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't seem to calm my nerves. As I lay in the darkness, my thoughts kept circling back to the note. "I've been watching you for days." What did that mean? How had they been watching me? Was it just coincidence that the messages seemed to coincide with my daily routine? Or was I truly being followed? The thought was terrifying. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The room felt too quiet, too still. Every creak of the house, every shift in the air felt like it was signaling something, a warning I couldn't understand. I finally drifted off into a fitful sleep, but even in my dreams, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I decided I needed to take action. I wasn't sure what exactly to do, but I had to figure out who was behind this. I called my friend, Matt, and told him what had happened. He listened intently as I explained the messages and the note in the parking lot. "Have you reported it to the police?" he asked. I hadn't even thought of that. The idea of involving the authorities made it feel all too real, but I couldn't ignore the strange events any longer. I had to do something. I promised Matt I would call the police, but I knew deep down that I wasn't ready for that step yet. I wasn't sure if it was serious enough for the authorities to get involved. It all felt too surreal. Could someone really be stalking me? Or was I just overreacting? As I hung up the phone, I noticed something strange. My phone had a new message notification. It was from the same unknown number. I opened it with a trembling hand. The message was short, as always. "I see you're still afraid. It won't be long now." The words sent a chill down my spine. Whoever this person was, they weren't just sending messages for the sake of it. They were toying with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening wasn't just going to stop. The days that followed only deepened the unsettling sense of dread that had taken root in me. What began as a single cryptic message had now morphed into a constant presence, creeping its way into my daily life. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but each day felt like I was walking on a tightrope, one misstep away from falling into something I couldn't comprehend. It seemed as if the walls of my reality were slowly closing in, and no matter how hard I tried to escape, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The messages came with increasing frequency, each one more chilling than the last. They were no longer confined to the unknown number that had first reached out to me. Now, the messages appeared on various platforms, text messages, social media, and even my email. Sometimes they were simple, cryptic phrases. "I'm closer than you think," or "You're not alone." Other times, they seemed more personalized, as if the sender had been watching my every move. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the first incident occurred that truly rattled me to my core. I was sitting at my desk at work, the hum of my computer and the quiet murmur of the office providing the usual background noise. I had been responding to emails, catching up on tasks I'd neglected over the weekend, when my phone buzzed on the desk in front of me. I glanced down, expecting to see a message from a coworker or perhaps a reminder for a meeting. But instead, the screen displayed a new notification, a message from the same unknown number that had been haunting me for days. I felt my heart skip a beat, the sudden jolt of fear shooting through my chest. I quickly picked up my phone and opened the message, my hands shaking. The words sent a chill down my spine. "I know what you did last night." I felt my stomach churn, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. What did they mean? What had I done? I hadn't done anything out of the ordinary, but the message made me feel like I was hiding something. A flash of paranoia hit me, and for a moment, I wondered if the sender knew things about me that I had long since buried. I scanned the office, but no one seemed to notice my sudden change in demeanor. I quickly shoved my phone back into my bag, my mind racing. Had someone been following me? Had I been unknowingly observed? The possibilities seemed endless, and none of them were comforting. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, my thoughts consumed by the message. Every time I glanced at my phone, I half expected another message to appear, a new piece of the puzzle that was rapidly unraveling. But none came. That night, I tried to unwind, hoping that a good night's sleep would reset my mind. I watched a show I'd been following for weeks, something lighthearted to take my mind off everything. But no matter how hard I tried, the dread never fully left. Every creak of the house seemed amplified. Every shadow in the corner of my eye seemed to hold some sinister potential. I knew I was being paranoid, but the nagging feeling that something was wrong wouldn't let me go. When I finally crawled into bed, my body tense, I reached for my phone once more. I had to check, had to see if there was another message. I opened my text messages, heart hammering in my chest. But what I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the list of messages, was a photo. At first, I thought it was just a random image sent by a friend, but as I opened it, the air seemed to freeze around me. The photo was taken from outside my bedroom window, taken from the exact spot where I had been sitting just an hour before, watching TV. The angle was perfect, capturing the glow of the television screen, the very spot where I had been seated. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been standing outside my house, spying on me. I immediately slammed my phone down on the bed, my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, a freak accident, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't imagining things. Whoever was behind this was getting closer, and they were not going to stop. I didn't sleep that night. I lay wide awake, the darkness of the room pressing in on me. Every sound, every shift in the air felt like a signal that someone was out there, watching, waiting. The silence of the house was suffocating, and every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the window, only amplified my fear. The next morning, I was exhausted. My eyes were heavy, my mind foggy from lack of sleep. But despite my exhaustion, I knew I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine. The events of the past few days were far too strange, far too personal to ignore. I had to find out who was behind this, and I had to do it fast. I spent the next few days obsessively checking my phone for any new messages. I called a few friends, told them what had been happening, and asked if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. But no one had any answers. Everyone seemed to think I was just stressed, that maybe I was overreacting to a few weird messages. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. This wasn't just a random coincidence, it was something more. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started looking into the phone number, trying to trace it back to its origin. I tried reverse lookups, checked social media, and even asked a few tech-savvy friends for help. But every time I tried to find something, I hit a dead end. The number was untraceable, like it had been carefully hidden. Whoever was behind it was smart, and they knew how to cover their tracks. On the fourth day, the messages began again. They came throughout the day, each one more disturbing than the last. But it was the final message that pushed me to the edge. It was a video, and as soon as I saw the thumbnail, I knew something was horribly wrong. My breath caught in my throat as I clicked on it. The video was dark at first, but as it began to load, I could make out the faintest shape in the shadows. It was a figure tall, almost unnaturally so, standing in my living room. The figure was barely visible, but the outline was unmistakable. The strange part? I was sitting in the exact same spot in the video, in front of the same television, exactly where I had been the night before. I immediately dropped the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, the walls too close. Whoever had been watching me was now inside my home, capturing footage of my every move. I felt a primal, instinctual fear rise up in me. This wasn't just some random person sending weird texts. It was someone who had been in my life, in my space, and they were getting closer. I immediately bolted out of the house, not even bothering to grab my keys. I needed air. I needed space. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. The messages, the videos, the feeling of being watched, it had all become too much. As I stood outside, my hands pressed against the cool metal of my car, I realized how completely powerless I was. Whoever was behind this had control over my life, my every move. I had no idea who they were or how they knew so much about me, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't safe. The question that kept ringing in my mind was, what did they want from me? What was the end game? And more importantly, who could I trust? The night had fallen heavy, wrapping the world in a blanket of suffocating darkness. I stood in the center of my living room, staring at the walls that now felt like the bars of a prison. The air was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. I had spent hours pacing, trying to make sense of everything, trying to wrap my mind around the idea that someone or something was systematically invading my life. The terror I felt now was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Every floorboard creak sent my pulse racing. Every gust of wind rattling the windows felt like the breath of something unseen, something just out of reach. I had no idea who this person was or what they wanted, but it had become abundantly clear. They weren't going to stop until they had their answer or until I did. I thought about calling the police again. I had done so once, after the video, the one where I was sitting in my own living room, captured from the shadows. But when I tried to explain the situation, when I told them about the strange messages and the feeling of being watched, I was met with skepticism. The officer who took my report told me it sounded like a prank or, at worst, some kind of stalker situation. He assured me that they would look into it, but they didn't take me seriously. And that's when it hit me. They wouldn't believe me. No one would believe me. Not unless something happened, something undeniable. As I stood there in the living room, my mind spinning with 1,000 possibilities, I noticed it again. That subtle, eerie sensation that had been creeping up on me for days. It was as if someone or something was standing just behind me. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing against me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my heartbeat quickened, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot as though some invisible force had me in its grip. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room. Nothing. The room was just as it had been when I first entered. The same familiar furniture, the same decorations that once made the space feel like home. But tonight, it was different. Everything felt foreign, unsettling. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the floor, came from the hallway behind me. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart seemed to stop beating for a moment. I knew I wasn't alone. The chilling realization swept over me like a cold wave. Someone was here. Someone was watching me. I spun around, my eyes darting towards the hallway. The lights flickered briefly, casting long, sharp shadows across the walls. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to stay put, to wait, to hide. But I couldn't just stand there, not after everything that had happened. I took a hesitant step toward the hallway, my footsteps muffled against the carpeted floor. I glanced back toward the front door, but it felt too far away. I couldn't escape. Not now. Not anymore. The sound came again, louder this time, unmistakable. Someone was moving in the darkness. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone, but as I did, I realized something. The screen was black, completely dead. I checked the battery fully charged. The phone had just shut off. My heart sank. I was alone, completely and utterly alone. I didn't know what to do. Every part of me screamed for escape, to flee, to run out the door and never look back. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Whoever or whatever was here wasn't going to let me go that easily. I stood in the middle of the hallway, breath shallow, my senses on high alert. The air felt thick, heavier than it should have been, as though the atmosphere itself was alive, watching me. I could feel it, something was coming closer. Then, as if on cue, the silence was shattered by a voice. Low, almost inaudible at first, like a whisper caught in the wind. It was coming from the living room, from behind me. You shouldn't have ignored me. The words sent a shock of ice through my veins. My entire body went rigid, my breath catching in my throat. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there, someone tangible, someone real. But there was nothing. Nothing but the familiar shadows of my living room. I reached for the light switch, my fingers trembling, but the moment I flicked it, the lights went out entirely. Darkness. Complete and utter darkness. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I thought it would burst. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next, my hands slick with sweat. And then, in the thick silence that followed, I heard it again. "You've been warned." This time, the voice was closer. So close that I could feel its breath on my skin. My pulse raced, the blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The terror was suffocating, like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any clue that could explain what was happening. But the room was still, too still. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light from the street lamp outside. Tall, impossibly tall, with a long coat that hung loosely around its form. It was motionless at first, like a statue, but as my eyes locked on it, it moved. Slowly, deliberately, step by step, it began to approach me. I froze. I couldn't move. The figure was coming closer, its presence overwhelming. My heart raced as it crossed the threshold into the room, stepping into the dim light that now barely illuminated the space. The figure's features were indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but I could make out the faint outline of a face pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into my soul. "You shouldn't have ignored me," it repeated, its voice cold and hollow, as if it came from somewhere far away. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but my body refused to cooperate. I was frozen, trapped in this moment, paralyzed by the sheer terror of the figure before me. And then, as if sensing my fear, it moved closer, its presence suffocating, filling the room with an overwhelming darkness. I could feel the air grow colder, the temperature dropping as if the very life had been drained from the space. I tried to speak, tried to ask it what it wanted, but no words came. I opened my mouth, but nothing. The terror in my chest strangled any attempt at sound. The figure stopped just in front of me, and for a long, agonizing moment, we stood there in the silence of the room. And then, in the quietest whisper, it spoke again. "You should have listened." The words sent a shudder through me, a final, terrifying confirmation that I had made the wrong choice. I had ignored the warnings, had tried to dismiss the creeping feeling of dread, and now I was paying the price. In that moment, everything seemed to collapse. The world around me seemed to spin, my vision blurring. My knees gave way, and I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling uncontrollably. I could feel the presence of the figure, hovering over me, watching, waiting. And I knew that no matter what I did, there was no escape. The lights flickered again, and for a brief second, the figure disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark. But the feeling of its presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to be shaken off. And in that moment, I realized I was no longer in control. This was it. The moment I had been dreading, the moment I couldn't outrun. The encounter that would change everything. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I lay there, still trembling on the floor. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my breaths coming in shallow, frantic gasps. The figure, if it even was a figure, had vanished. The weight in the room seemed to lift slightly, though I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next moment to strike. I didn't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Time had lost all meaning. It could have been minutes or hours. I could barely process what had just happened. What was that thing? A shadow? A person? A nightmare? And why was it haunting me, torturing me like this? I felt the cold creeping into my skin, the chill that seemed to come not just from the air, but from within, deep in my bones. I forced myself to sit up, feeling the coolness of the hardwood floor beneath me. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, but it was the kind of silence that pressed against you, suffocating you in its weight. I wanted to flee, to run, to escape, to get out of this house that had become a prison. But I couldn't. It felt like I was trapped in my own skin, as though the very act of running would be futile. The figure had made it clear that there was no escaping it. No matter where I went, it would find me. But still, I had to try. I scrambled to my feet, my knees weak beneath me. I glanced around the room, my eyes wild, searching for anything, any sign that I was not alone. The living room, once so familiar, now felt foreign, haunted. It was like something had changed inside me, as if the walls themselves had turned against me. My phone was still dead, the screen black and unresponsive. I had no way to contact anyone. No one could help me now. I rushed toward the front door. I needed to leave. I needed to get out, to escape, to put as much distance between myself and this house as possible. But when I reached for the doorknob, it wouldn't turn. I tried again, panic rising in my chest, but it was like the door was locked. No matter how hard I twisted, it wouldn't open. I pulled harder, but it was useless. I wasn't going anywhere. The air grew even colder, and the faint scent of something metallic filled my nose like iron or blood. It made my stomach churn. I looked around, trying to steady myself, but the room seemed to close in, the walls narrowing, the shadows growing deeper. I could feel it now, the presence in the room, not just in the corners or behind me, but everywhere. It was all around me, suffocating me. I tried to call out, to scream for help, but my voice wouldn't come. It was as if the air itself had been sucked from my lungs, leaving me gasping. And then, the voice. "You should have listened." It came again, clear this time, resonating through the room like a hollow echo. It was no longer just a whisper, but a command, a judgment. I spun around, heart racing. There was nothing, no figure, no shape. Just the darkness, stretching further, curling around me like a predator waiting to strike. I stumbled back, my hand reaching for anything to steady myself. It landed on the edge of the table, and I grasped it, trying to keep myself from falling apart. But then, something unexpected happened. The door to the living room, the one that had been locked moments before, creaked open slowly. I froze, my eyes widening. My first instinct was to flee, to run as far as I could, but I knew that there was nowhere to go. The house was like a cage. The door opened wider, revealing nothing but darkness on the other side. I didn't know if I was imagining it. Maybe it was just my fear, making my senses play tricks on me. But something told me that this was it, that this was my way out. With every ounce of strength I had left, I bolted toward the door, through the dark hallway. My legs felt like lead, my body numb, but I pushed forward, ignoring the crushing fear that tried to pull me back. I needed to escape, to leave whatever had been haunting me behind. I couldn't stay here any longer. I reached the front door again, my heart in my throat. The lock that had refused to budge before was now easily undone, as though something had released its hold on it. The door swung open, and I stepped outside, blinking in the moonlight. The cool night air hit my face, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the house. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the fresh air. For a moment, I felt free. I felt like I had escaped. But when I turned back to look at the house, something stopped me in my tracks. The windows. Every single one was dark, lifeless except one. The one in the center. There, just behind the glass, stood a figure, a silhouette. It was impossible to make out any features, but I knew it was there. I felt it, as if the eyes of the figure were boring into my soul. It wasn't a trick of the light. I had seen enough to know that whatever it was real. It was watching me. I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the ground, my entire body shaking. The figure remained still, unmoving, like a statue. And in that stillness, I understood something. The entity, the shadow, whatever it wasn't going to let me go. Not now. Not ever. I didn't know how to fight it. I didn't know if it was even possible to escape it. All I knew was that it wasn't finished with me yet. I ran. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't care where I was going. I didn't care about anything except getting away from that house, from that presence, from whatever had been toying with me for so long. But even as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed, that the figure was still watching me, waiting for the next moment to strike. It felt like a curse, like something I couldn't outrun. Weeks passed after that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't sleep without the images of the figure in the window, the voice in the darkness, the overwhelming presence that had taken over my life. I tried to move on. I tried to forget, but the fear lingered in the corners of my mind, lurking just out of sight. I could never fully shake it. I would never be able to explain what happened that night, and I would never be able to shake the feeling that whatever it was still out there, waiting for the right moment. As I look back now, I can only reflect on what I experienced, what I went through, what we went through. But even as I try to find meaning, I know that some things aren't meant to be understood. The mystery lingers, like an open wound that refuses to heal. And I'll never be sure if I truly escaped, or if I'm just waiting for it to return. And perhaps, in the quietest moments, I'll still hear that voice. You should have listened. It's hard to find peace after something like that. I tell myself that I'm free, that whatever it was is no longer following me, but there are moments when I question it. I'll wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, thinking I hear someone standing just outside my door. Or sometimes, when I look out the window at night, I swear I can see a shadow move across the street, as though it's waiting, watching. But I try to push those thoughts away. I try not to let them control me, because the truth is, I don't know what's real anymore. As strange as it sounds, I've come to realize that there are things in this world that we may never fully understand. There are forces that exist beyond our comprehension, things that may never be fully explained or made sense of. Maybe that night wasn't just some trick of the mind or an unfortunate series of events. Maybe it was something more. Maybe it was a warning. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something much darker, something that will always linger in the background, waiting to resurface. I can't say for certain whether it was a ghost, a shadow, or something else entirely. I've heard other people's stories, people who have gone through similar experiences, and sometimes their stories align with mine. Other times, their encounters are even more unsettling. But in the end, no one can say for sure what's out there in the dark spaces of this world. The truth is, there are more questions than answers when it comes to the unexplained. And sometimes, that's the scariest part. But I do know one thing for sure, I'm not the same person I was before. Whatever that thing was, whatever it was trying to communicate or do, it's changed me. It's left an imprint on my soul, one that I can't erase. I may have walked away from that house, but I'll never truly escape what I experienced there. The memory of it, the fear of it, will always be with me. And so, I share this story with you not just as a warning, but as a reminder. Sometimes, the things we fear the most aren't the ones we can see or touch. They're the ones we can't explain, the ones that make us question what we know about the world and ourselves. If there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that we can't always outrun our fears. They find a way back, no matter how far we go or how fast we try to leave. But as I sit here, reflecting on everything that's happened, I also realize that I've gained something from it, something that's hard to put into words. It's a deeper understanding of the unknown, a heightened sense of awareness that will stay with me forever. And though the fear still lingers, it's no longer as overpowering as it once was. I've learned to accept that some things are beyond our control, beyond our understanding, and that's okay. We don't need all the answers to move forward. So, as you listen to this story, I want you to think about your own experiences, the things that might be lingering just beneath the surface of your reality. Have you ever felt something you couldn't explain? Have you ever encountered something that made your skin crawl, even though you couldn't put your finger on why? It's possible that what you experienced wasn't just in your mind. Maybe it was something more. And maybe, like me, you'll carry that mystery with you forever. I encourage you to pay attention to the world around you, to the signs, to the feelings that don't quite make sense. Listen to your gut, your instincts, because sometimes they know things we don't. Whether it's a shadow in the corner of your room, an unexplained noise in the middle of the night, or a sudden chill that runs down your spine, take note. You never know when the world will reveal something that challenges everything you thought you knew. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you feel that same unease creeping in, remember one thing: you are not alone. These things, these experiences have been happening for as long as humans have walked this earth. Maybe we'll never fully understand them, but we can learn to live with them. We can accept that some things are better left unexplained. It was a cold winter day, just a few weeks before the new year. I had been looking forward to my solo hiking trip for months. There's something about being alone in nature, completely disconnected from the chaos of the world, that always helps me clear my mind. I had spent days planning the route, checking weather forecasts, and ensuring that I had all the gear I would need for this winter adventure. I had done this kind of thing before, so I felt confident. Maybe too confident. The plan was simple: head out to the mountains for a couple of days, take in the fresh air, and enjoy the solitude. I wasn't looking for anything extraordinary, just some peace and quiet away from the noise of daily life. It was a routine I had grown fond of over the years, something that brought me clarity and a sense of calm. I was used to long hikes through forests and up hills, the type of outdoor experiences that challenge you physically, but leave you with a sense of accomplishment when you reach the top. The mountains I chose this time were known for their rugged terrain, thick with trees, and often covered in a blanket of snow at this time of year. The snow had fallen heavily that week, and the ground was completely blanketed, leaving a pristine white world all around. The sky was overcast, but the sun managed to peek through just enough to cast a cold, soft light on the landscape. I was no stranger to the wilderness. In fact, I had spent more time hiking than most of my friends and family, so the prospect of venturing out alone didn't faze me at all. I felt equipped to handle whatever the elements could throw at me. The sense of peace I felt as I set off that morning was palpable. Just me, the snow, and the silence. I made my way through the forest with ease, the only sound being the crunch of my boots against the snow. The crisp air filled my lungs as I walked further into the woods, my backpack snug on my shoulders, carrying everything I needed for the few days I planned to spend there. I was in no rush, taking my time to enjoy the serenity that the wilderness offered. The solitude was both comforting and empowering. I'd been hiking for a couple of hours when I came across a small clearing. The snow had settled here more deeply, undisturbed and untouched. There was something almost serene about the space, as if time had stopped in this small corner of the world. I decided to stop for a while, take in the scenery, and drink some water. It was moments like this that made the trek worthwhile. As I sat down to rest, I looked around. There was a quiet beauty in the stillness of the snow-covered landscape. Nothing moved. There was no sign of animals, no footprints in the snow. It was just me and the world in front of me. The trees were bare, their branches heavy with snow, bending slightly under the weight. The mountains loomed in the distance, silent and majestic. I pulled out my map and checked my route. I had already crossed the area I had planned for the morning and was now heading into more unfamiliar terrain. I had spent a lot of time reading up on the area, so I wasn't too worried. The path was well marked, and I was prepared for whatever I might encounter. But as I sat there, soaking in the quiet and drinking my water, I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything specific. There was no obvious danger, no threatening sounds. But something about the landscape, the silence, felt a little off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I had been hiking alone for a while now, and the emptiness of the snow-covered woods seemed to magnify every sound, every movement, even the ones that weren't there. After a few moments of reflection, I stood up and continued on my path. The sun was slowly sinking lower in the sky, and I knew I needed to make it to my planned campsite before nightfall. There was no sense in pushing further into the unknown without enough daylight left. As I walked on, the forest grew denser, and the snow deeper. The trail was becoming harder to follow, and I found myself looking down at my feet more often, making sure I didn't lose my way. That's when I first noticed the footprints. At first, they didn't seem out of place. I assumed they were from a fellow hiker who had passed through earlier that day or the day before. But as I examined them closer, I realized something strange. They were far too fresh to have been made more than a few hours ago. The edges were sharp, clearly visible against the untouched snow surrounding them. There was no sign of anyone else in the area, no evidence of a hiker or a snowshoe path nearby. Just these footprints. They were wrong. Not the typical prints I would expect from boots or shoes. They were too small, too delicate, and yet the impressions were deep, like the person who had made them weighed far less than I did. I bent down to examine them further, my curiosity piqued. They led off the path, heading into an area I hadn't planned to go. I stood up and looked around. No other signs of life, just the silence and the snow. The odd feeling in my gut grew stronger. The footprints were too perfect, too symmetrical. They didn't look like someone had wandered off the trail. They looked intentional, like they had been placed there. I took a step back, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. What struck me the most was the direction in which they led. They didn't lead back towards civilization or even toward a natural clearing or campsite. No, they led into the dense, untouched part of the forest, into a direction that made no sense. There was nothing out there, no road, no camp, nothing. But with a mix of hesitation and intrigue, I decided to follow them. I couldn't explain it, but something inside me felt like I had to. As I followed the footprints, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The snow had become denser, and the world around me felt quieter somehow. The air seemed thicker, heavier. I had been hiking for hours and was used to the stillness of the forest, but this was different. The silence felt almost suffocating, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The footprints I was following were sharp and clear, almost too perfect. They led deeper into the woods, away from the main path I had been following. The more I walked, the more I noticed the oddness of it all. There were no other tracks around, no sign of anyone else. Just these strange, small impressions in the snow, growing fainter and fainter as they disappeared into the dense underbrush. It was then that I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. A faint sound. At first, I thought it was just the winds rustling through the trees. But as I listened more closely, I realized that it wasn't the winds. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like footsteps. But no one was around. The sound was coming from up ahead, just beyond the reach of my sight, hidden by the thick trees. I paused, listening intently. My pulse quickened, my breath coming out in little puffs of vapor as I stood motionless. The tapping continued, faint but steady. There was no mistaking it. Now it was coming from someone or something ahead of me. I should have turned back then. I should have listened to that gut feeling, the one that was screaming at me to leave, to get out of the woods and back to safety. But I didn't. For some reason, I felt compelled to press on. The tracks were still fresh, leading me forward, and the tapping sound kept calling me forward as well, like it was urging me to keep going. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching in the snow. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up and my senses sharpened. The air seemed to grow colder, almost as if I had walked into a different world. The forest around me felt increasingly unnatural. There was a thick, oppressive quiet now, broken only by the faint tapping that seemed to echo through the trees. The further I walked, the stronger the feeling grew, like someone or something was just out of sight, watching me. My steps became slower, more deliberate, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently, as if expecting to find someone right behind me. But each time I turned around, there was nothing. The tapping didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. I couldn't understand where it was coming from. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was a bird. Maybe it was a creature hidden in the trees. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something wrong. Something wasn't adding up. As I pressed on, I noticed that the footprints I had been following had changed. At first, they had been clean, clear prints in the snow, but now they were muddled. It was as though the ground around them had been disturbed, as if something or someone had been dragging something heavy through the snow. The impressions were deeper now, wider, like they were being made by something much larger than the small, delicate prints I had been following before. I stopped for a moment, taking in the new tracks. The unease that had been creeping at the back of my mind turned into something more visceral fear. My breath came quicker, and the quiet of the forest felt more threatening now. I had to make a decision. I could turn back. I could go back to the clearing where I had stopped earlier, head back toward the main path, and forget this strange encounter. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave. A strange part of me, the part that had kept me going despite the eerie tapping, despite the growing sense of dread, still wanted to know what was ahead, wanted to understand what was happening in the woods. I continued walking, carefully navigating through the trees, each step heavy with the knowledge that I was venturing further into the unknown. Then, as I rounded a bend in the path, I saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a blur, a dark shape standing among the trees. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. The figure was still, motionless, like it was waiting for something. I couldn't make out any details from where I stood. It was too far away, hidden behind a cluster of trees. But something in my gut told me this was no ordinary person. There was something wrong about it. I felt a chill wash over me, and I instinctively took a step back. But before I could turn and run, I saw the figure move. It wasn't a simple movement, like someone turning to walk away or adjusting their position. It was jerky, unnatural, as though the figure was being dragged or pulled in some way. The moment I saw that, a flood of terror washed over me. I didn't care about the mystery, about the footprints, or the strange sound. I knew then, in the deepest part of me, that I had made a mistake. This wasn't a normal hike. This wasn't an ordinary forest. Without thinking, I turned and bolted, my legs pumping furiously through the snow. I didn't care about the tracks anymore. I didn't care about the figure or the noise. All I wanted was to get out, to get back to safety. But the snow was thick, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I stumbled, my breath ragged as I pushed through the deep snow. Behind me, there was nothing but the whisper of the wind and the haunting feeling that I wasn't alone. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, though I'm sure it was only a few minutes. When I finally slowed down, I was at a small clearing, one I recognized. My campsite was nearby, and I could hear the familiar sound of my gear, untouched, waiting for me. But as I caught my breath and looked around, something stopped me in my tracks. The footprints were back. The same footprints I had seen before, leading in the direction I had just come from, as if I had never left. My heart dropped. There was no way. No one had passed me. I had been alone. I slowly turned around, my eyes scanning the area behind me, the trees now silent. The feeling of being watched returned, even more intense than before. But no figure appeared. There was nothing, only the tracks leading away from me, deeper into the woods. The tapping had stopped. The silence was even more deafening now. I knew then I was not alone. Something was out there, and it was following me. As I stood there, trying to catch my breath in that eerie clearing, something inside me snapped. I had to figure out what was going on. I couldn't just run from it, not without understanding what was happening to me. The tracks were unmistakable, leading further into the snow-covered woods. And the tapping, the presence that had been stalking me, hadn't gone away. It was just waiting for the right moment to reappear. It had been hours since I'd seen the figure move in the woods, but the memory was fresh, like it had happened just moments ago. The sound of those jerky movements, unnatural, like someone or something wasn't quite human, haunted me. And that silence, the thick, oppressive silence that hung in the air like a suffocating fog made it all the more terrifying. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to know what was out there, and maybe, just maybe, if I understood what was happening, I could stop it. Or, at the very least, survive it. So, I did the one thing that terrified me most. I walked back into the woods. I retraced my steps carefully, watching the snow beneath my boots, the prints that had once led me into the unknown. Now, they seemed to mock me, their clarity too perfect, their consistency almost impossible. The air was colder than before, biting at my exposed skin, and with every step, the silence grew thicker, heavier. There was no wind, no animal sounds. Just the sound of my own breath, shallow and ragged as I pushed myself forward. The forest felt like it had turned against me, the trees looming overhead like silent, indifferent sentinels. The path seemed to stretch on forever, the snow untouched, except for the tracks I was following. I paused every few steps, glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. No tapping, no figure, just the deepening quiet wrapping around me like a second skin. I had walked for what felt like hours, but the forest didn't seem to be getting any closer to the clearing I'd been hoping for. The tracks were still leading me deeper into the woods, but now they seemed to be spreading, as if someone or something was walking in multiple directions at once. I felt a sudden surge of dread, my gut tightening as I stared at the tracks. And then, out of nowhere, the sound returned. It was faint at first, just the softest rustle through the trees, but it quickly grew louder. It wasn't tapping anymore. It was more like the dragging of something heavy across the snow, a dragging that came closer and closer, moving with purpose. My heart pounded in my chest, and I froze in place, every muscle in my body rigid with fear. I held my breath, straining to hear through the thick, suffocating silence. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, until it was right behind me. But there was nothing there. No figure, no shape, just the sound of something being dragged through the snow, slowly, methodically, inch by inch. I whirled around, scanning the darkening woods behind me, my heart racing. Nothing. The trees were empty, the snow undisturbed. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind an oppressive stillness. I turned back around, my hands trembling at my sides, unsure of what to do. But when my eyes fell on the snow in front of me, I froze again. There were more tracks, different from the ones I had been following earlier. These were deeper, wider, more erratic. The prints were fresh, and they looked as though they had been made by something large, something heavy, something that shouldn't have been out there at all. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at them, unable to move. The tracks led to a small rise in the snow, a hill that wasn't there before, as though the ground had shifted while I wasn't looking. As if the forest itself had grown around me. I couldn't remember passing by this area earlier, and for a moment, I doubted my own memory. Had I been here before? I shook my head, trying to clear my mind. I had to keep moving. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward cautiously, the snow crunching beneath my boots. But the moment my foot landed, I felt it. A jolt of cold that ran up my leg, deep into my bones, like I had just stepped into a freezer. It wasn't normal. I could feel the cold radiating from the earth itself, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I moved quickly, my mind racing. What was happening? The temperature had dropped, the air heavier than before, almost suffocating. My fingers ached in the cold, my nose numb as I pressed on, following the tracks that led further into the woods. The trees around me seemed to close in, their twisted branches blocking out what little light remained in the sky. The shadows were long now, creeping along the ground like fingers reaching for me, pulling me deeper into the darkened forest. I could hear the sound again, the dragging noise, soft and steady, like someone or something was following me, just out of sight. I picked up the pace, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. But with every step I took, the sound grew louder, closer. I could feel it in my bones now, the scrape of something large moving through the snow, close enough to touch. I couldn't see it, I couldn't hear anything else. Just that dragging noise, growing louder with every passing moment. And then, without warning, it stopped. The silence returned, thick and absolute. The weight of it was crushing, suffocating. I stood still, waiting for something to break the tension, waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't. I glanced around, unsure of what to do next. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if it were waiting for me to make the next move. The tracks were still there, still leading me forward, but I hesitated. What if I turned back? What if I just ran, as fast as I could, back to the clearing? But the thought of those footprints following me, the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the trees, stopped me. I knew I couldn't leave. Not until I understood what was happening. I took another step, moving forward into the unknown. And that's when I saw it. In the distance, just beyond a thick stand of trees, there was a shape. A figure. Standing perfectly still, facing me. I couldn't make out any details, only the silhouette of a person, dark against the pale snow, unmoving. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I knew it was the same figure I had seen earlier, the one that had moved unnaturally through the woods. The one that had been dragging itself behind me, silently following my every step. But now, it was waiting for me. I could feel it in my gut, a primal instinct that screamed at me to run, to turn around and never look back. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, its presence drawing me in like a magnet, pulling me forward against my will. I took one step, then another, my body moving without my consent. And as I got closer, the figure shifted. It didn't move. It didn't walk. It just shifted, like a shadow bending and warping, pulling itself into a new shape. My blood ran cold as I stared, unable to process what I was seeing. Then, without warning, it was gone. The figure had disappeared, leaving nothing behind but the cold, empty forest and the ever-present dragging sound. But now, it wasn't coming from behind me. It was in front of me. The tracks were gone, and all that remained were the shadows of the trees, standing silent and unmoving in the dark. I was no longer alone. Something else was here with me. Something I didn't understand. Something that wasn't human. And I had no idea how to escape. I had been walking for what seemed like days, even though it was only hours. Every step felt like it was leading me deeper into the heart of something unnatural. The trees towered above me, their blackened trunks like looming giants, their limbs twisted into grotesque shapes. I kept moving, trying to keep my mind focused, but every crack of a branch, every faint rustle in the distance sent my heart into overdrive. I was no longer sure what was real anymore. As I pushed forward, the air grew denser, heavier. The cold wasn't just in the atmosphere, now it was inside me. I could feel it gnawing at my bones, spreading through my body like poison. I had never experienced anything like this before. Every breath I took felt sharp, like inhaling broken glass. The forest around me seemed to press in, suffocating me, wrapping its twisted limbs around my mind. And then it happened. I was walking, eyes scanning the darkening path ahead, when I heard a sound faint but unmistakable. A voice. It was so soft at first that I thought it was just the wind, a trick of my exhausted mind. But as I stopped in my tracks, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. The voice called my name. It wasn't just any voice. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but somehow it felt familiar. It had an eerie resonance, as though it was coming from the very trees themselves, from the earth beneath my feet. It was low and drawn out, almost like it was struggling to be heard. But it was clear enough that I could no longer deny what was happening. I whipped my head around, searching the shadows, but saw nothing. The forest was still, the air heavy with silence, but that voice, my name, still hung in the air, as though the forest itself was speaking to me. Or worse, something was using the forest to speak to me. Is someone there? My voice trembled as I whispered into the stillness, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. There was no answer, just the chilling silence of the trees standing witness to my fear. But then I heard it again. My name. Louder this time, sharper, as though it was coming from behind me. Turn around. I didn't want to. I didn't want to face whatever it was that was calling to me, but I knew I had no choice. My body moved against my will, my legs carrying me slowly, reluctantly, toward the sound. With every step I took, the fear gripped me tighter, a cold, suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest. When I turned, there it was. At first, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was just a figure standing there in the snow, like a silhouette against the dimming sky. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it seemed to sway with the wind, though I could feel no breeze. The shape was distorted, its features blurred and shifting, like a smear on the edge of my vision. It was as though the figure was made of the darkness itself, a shadow that didn't belong in the world of light. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat deafening in my ears. The figure was standing there, just beyond the trees, watching me. Its form shifted again, this time in a way that felt unnatural. It wasn't a human shape. No, this thing wasn't human. It was something else entirely. The air around me seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't understand. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as though it was alive, shifting, reacting to the presence of this thing. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. My legs shook, unable to hold me up any longer. I sank to my knees, my eyes fixed on the figure, and I couldn't look away. For a moment, it was still. I thought maybe it would just vanish, that it was some trick of the light, some product of my fear and exhaustion. But then it moved. Not in the way a person moves, but in the way a shadow stretches and twists. It was like watching liquid bend and shift, a form that didn't obey the laws of physics. The figure reached out toward me, its long, shadowy arms stretching unnaturally wide, the movement so smooth it seemed to defy all logic. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only watch as the figure approached, closer and closer, until it was standing right in front of me. Its face, if you could call it, that was a void. No features. Just empty darkness. It was as though it had no form at all, no identity, nothing to make it human. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a murmur. It was a low, guttural sound that resonated deep inside my skull, vibrating through my very bones. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. The words were so clear, so real, that they felt like a physical blow. I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Every part of me screamed to run, to escape, but my body refused to move. I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg for mercy, but no sound escaped my mouth. My throat was tight, choked with fear, and all I could do was stare at the figure in front of me, frozen in place, unable to look away. "You should never have followed the footprints," it continued, its voice twisting with an anger I couldn't comprehend. "Now, you are part of the forest. You belong to it now." I didn't understand. Part of the forest? What did that even mean? What was this thing? Why was it here? What did it want with me? Before I could even process the words, the figure raised its arm, and I felt something icy cold as death seep into my chest. It wasn't physical. It was something worse. Something that gnawed at my soul, stripping me of my will. I felt like I was being pulled into the darkness, like it was swallowing me whole, consuming everything I was. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't scream. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The coldness remained, though. It clung to me, wrapping around me like an invisible hand, gripping me with a force I couldn't escape. The world felt empty now, hollow, as though it had been drained of life. The trees no longer stood tall and imposing. They felt twisted, contorted, like grotesque versions of what they once were. I didn't understand. I didn't know what had just happened. But one thing was clear. Whatever I had seen, whatever I had felt, wasn't over. It was still out there, in the woods, waiting for me. And it wasn't going to let me leave. My heart was racing. My body was shaking uncontrollably, and the darkness pressed in all around me. But I had to get out. I had to survive. And as I turned to flee, I heard it again. My name. But this time, it wasn't a voice. It was a whisper. It was a command. And it was coming from the trees. "Come back," it said. "Come back and be part of us." I stumbled backward, my mind a blur, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way out. Not anymore. The forest had claimed me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I didn't remember how I made it out of the forest. One moment, I was running, stumbling through the snow, fighting against the cold and the crushing weight of the forest that seemed to close in on me with every step. The next, I was standing at the edge of the woods, breathing hard, my body shaking uncontrollably. My mind was a fog, clouded by fear, panic, and confusion. I don't know how I managed to escape, but somehow I did. The forest was behind me, the dark trees fading into the distance as I stumbled across an open field. The moonlight illuminated the snow-covered ground, the soft glow making everything look serene and untouched. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. I had made it to the edge, but that didn't mean I was free. The cold air cut through me, sharp and biting, but it wasn't the cold that bothered me. No, it was the weight of what had happened. The figure, the voice, the feeling of being consumed by the forest, it all felt so real, so tangible. It wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or fear. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. I tried to push it out of my mind. I had to get back to civilization. I had to get back to safety. But as I looked around, trying to find a path back to the nearest town, I realized something that stopped me in my tracks. The landscape around me was unfamiliar. I had been hiking these woods for hours, no, for days, and yet the field I found myself in was nothing like anything I had seen before. It was too quiet, too still. I scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of life, but there was nothing. No roads, no lights in the distance, no sound of animals or people. Just snow and the distant whisper of the wind. It didn't make sense. I had crossed miles of terrain. I should have seen something. A cabin, a trail, anything. But there was nothing, just an endless stretch of white. Panic began to set in again, creeping up my spine like an icy hand. I couldn't stay here. I had to move. I had to find help. But no matter which direction I turned, the same haunting emptiness greeted me. It was as though the world around me was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then I heard it. The voice. Not the same one I'd heard in the forest, but something different. A distant echo, like a faint cry carried on the wind. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing. No figure. No presence. Only the snow and the silence. I should have kept moving, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Something told me to listen, to wait. The sound came again. It was clearer now. A voice, faint but unmistakable. This time, it wasn't my name that it called. It wasn't the eerie whisper I had heard before. It was a laugh. Low, slow, and unsettling. It echoed across the field like it was coming from all around me, from the very air itself. I felt my stomach twist, nausea rising in my throat. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the snow. The cold stung against my skin, but it was nothing compared to the cold that had settled deep within me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. What was happening? What was this place? And why did I feel like I was still trapped in the forest? For the longest time, I sat there, frozen in the snow, listening to the mocking laughter that seemed to come from every direction. It felt like I was being drawn into the darkness again, pulled back into the nightmare I had just escaped. My body wanted to run, but my mind refused to let me. I was paralyzed by fear. It was as if the forest hadn't let me go, as if it had found a way to follow me, to haunt me even outside its borders. There was no escape. I didn't know how long I sat there. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time felt like it had stopped, frozen in the grip of whatever had happened to me. I don't remember standing up, but somehow I was on my feet again. My legs shook beneath me, but I forced myself to move, stumbling forward, my eyes desperately searching for any sign of help, of life. But the field remained silent, still, unyielding. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the voice stopped. The laughter, the whispers, all of it, gone. The world around me was quiet once more, as though nothing had happened. I couldn't trust my own senses. I didn't know if I was awake or if I was trapped in some twisted dream. But one thing was clear. I was no longer in control. I kept moving, no longer questioning my surroundings. I had to get out. I had to find my way back to safety, back to the world I knew. The rest of the journey back was a blur. I don't remember how long it took or how I made it through the rest of the wilderness, but eventually I found my way to a road. A truck passed by, and I waved it down, my voice barely a whisper. I don't even remember the driver's face, but I'm sure he saw the terror in mine. I was brought to a nearby town, and the first thing I did was check into a motel. I locked the door behind me, pulled the curtain shut, and sat in the corner of the room, my body trembling with exhaustion. I had escaped the forest, but the forest hadn't escaped me. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard something faint, like a rustle in the distance. I told myself it was just the wind, but in my heart, I knew the truth. It wasn't the wind. The forest had never truly let me go. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. Who would believe me? How could I explain the things I had seen, the feelings I had felt? There were no answers, no explanations. It wasn't something you could talk about. It wasn't something anyone would understand. So I kept it to myself, buried it deep inside me. But every now and then, when the wind picks up and the world is quiet, I hear it again. That voice, calling my name. And I know, deep down, that I haven't escaped. It was the fall of 1997, the kind of autumn where the air turned crisp and dry leaves crackled beneath your feet with every step. The small town of Hollow Creek, tucked away in the heart of the Midwest, had a quiet charm. It was the sort of place where everyone knew each other's names, and life moved at an unhurried pace. This was where my family, my wife Ellen, our 2 children, Michael and Abby, and I had decided to settle down after years of moving from city to city. We were looking for stability, a place where we could finally call home. Hollow Creek was perfect in many ways. The town streets were lined with modest houses that had stood the test of time, each one with its own story, its own character. Some had been passed down through generations, others carried the weight of whispered legends. But there was one house that stood apart from the rest, an imposing Victorian structure that had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. It was the kind of house that children avoided on Halloween, where teenagers dared each other to spend a night, but always backed out at the last minute. The house stood at the end of Oak Hollow Road, its once white paint now peeled and weathered, revealing dark wooden panels beneath. Shutters hung loose, swaying with the wind, and the front gate, rusted and creaky, was overgrown with ivy that clawed at the entrance. Neighbors spoke of the place with a mix of caution and intrigue, weaving stories of why it had been left to decay for decades. But to me, it was just another house old and in need of work, sure, but full of potential. When the "for sale" sign appeared in its front yard, I felt a pull I couldn't quite explain. Ellen was skeptical from the start. "Are you sure about this?" she had asked, raising an eyebrow as she studied the photograph in the real estate brochure. "It looks like it's one bad storm away from collapsing." Michael, our 12-year-old, was more enthusiastic, already envisioning a new room where he could hang up posters of his favorite rock bands. Abby, who was only 8, stayed close to me, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her bright blue eyes wide and curious. "We'll fix it up," I said, trying to reassure Ellen, even as I felt a small shiver dance along my spine. "It'll be an adventure." I wasn't entirely sure who I was trying to convince her or myself. Within weeks, the paperwork was signed, and the house at 432 Oak Hollow Road was ours. Moving day came with all the usual chaos. Boxes stacked in every room, the clatter of furniture being arranged and rearranged, the scent of fresh paint and sawdust hanging in the air. As the last rays of daylight slipped behind the horizon, casting long creeping shadows through the house, I felt a strange sensation, like we were being watched. I shrugged it off, busying myself with unpacking plates in the kitchen. Ellen's voice called from upstairs. "Did you put this here?" she asked, holding up an old, worn-out key that had been sitting on the dresser in our room. It was ornate, with intricate designs etched into the metal, nothing like the modern keys we had. "No, I haven't seen that before," I replied, my brow furrowing as I took it from her and turned it over in my hand. It was heavy, its age palpable. Ellen's eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us said a word. Michael burst in, carrying a box marked books. "What's that?" he asked, peering at the key curiously. "Just an old key," I said, forcing a smile and slipping it into my pocket. "Probably left behind by the previous owners." I told myself that it wasn't unusual for old houses to come with forgotten trinkets. But when Abby tugged at my sleeve, whispering, I heard someone walking upstairs. The unease settled deeper in my chest. "It's just the house settling," I said, my voice more confident than I felt. But as I glanced up the staircase, where the hallway disappeared into darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the house had stirred, as if waking from a long, dreamless sleep. The days passed, and our routine fell into place. Mornings were filled with the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen and the clatter of breakfast plates as we rushed to get the kids to school. Evenings were quieter, marked by the soft hum of the television and the creak of the floorboards as we moved from room to room. On the surface, everything seemed normal, even peaceful. But there was an unspoken tension that lingered, like the quiet before a storm. One night, as I sat in my study going over paperwork, a faint thud echoed from the attic above. I paused, pen hovering over the page, my heart suddenly racing. It was likely just a raccoon or a bird, I reasoned. But when Ellen appeared at the doorway, her face pale, I knew she'd heard it too. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. I nodded, placing the pen down. "I'll go check." The attic was a place we had barely touched since moving in. It was dusty, filled with old trunks and broken furniture covered in yellowed sheets. As I climbed the ladder, each step groaned under my weight, the noise amplified in the quiet houses. I reached the top and aimed my flashlight around the space. Dust motes danced in the beam, and for a moment, everything was still. And then, just as I was about to turn back, a faint whisper, or was it a sigh, seemed to drift through the cold, stale air. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, listening. But there was only silence, thick and suffocating. "Anything up there?" Ellen called from below, her voice tense. "Just old junk," I lied, my eyes darting around one last time before descending the ladder. But as I reached the bottom, I couldn't help but feel that something had been watching me from the darkness above. We moved into the house in late November, just as the last of the autumn leaves were swept away by chilly gusts. The process of settling in was as chaotic as expected, boxes strewn across rooms, the echoes of our footsteps sounding strangely hollow against the high ceilings. It was an old house, no doubt about it, and with that age came quirks. The floorboards creaked underfoot, drafts whispered through unseen cracks, and the scent of dust and aged wood hung in the air like an invisible veil. At first, these oddities were easy to dismiss. Old houses make old noises, I'd tell Ellen whenever she mentioned the strange sounds at night. She'd nod, half convinced, but her eyes would linger a moment too long on the darkened hallways, Michael and Abby, on the other hand, were fascinated. The winding staircase, the tiny attic door that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale, all seemed like an adventure to them. The first few days were filled with the usual hustle of unpacking and arranging furniture. It wasn't until the third night that the house began to show its true nature. It started subtly, almost too subtly to register. We were in the middle of dinner, the four of us gathered around the mahogany dining table that came with the house, a piece so large and solid that it looked as though it had been carved from a single tree. Ellen had just set down a plate of roast chicken when we heard it, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the direction of the hallway. Michael paused mid-bite, eyes wide as he looked at me. "Did you hear that, Dad?" "It's probably just the wind," I said quickly, but I couldn't help the way my gaze darted to the hallway, now shrouded in shadows. Ellen's hand hovered over her plate, her brow furrowing. "It didn't sound like the wind," she said softly. We sat in silence for a moment, listening. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I forced a smile, trying to shake off the unease that had settled like a weight in my chest. "Old houses," I said again, my voice firmer this time. The kids returned to their meal, but Ellen's eyes remained fixed on the hallway, a crease forming between her eyebrows. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Ellen and I sat in the living room. The fire crackled, its light casting dancing shadows on the walls. The tapping sound still lingered in the back of my mind, but I pushed it away, attributing it to the house settling. We'd made a big move, and nerves were bound to run high. Ellen leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder. "Do you really think it's just the house?" she whispered. I hesitated before answering. "I do," I lied, tightening my arm around her. But deep down, there was a nagging feeling I couldn't quite dismiss. The next day passed uneventfully, but by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the uneasy stillness returned. The kids were in their rooms, and Ellen and I were in the kitchen, going through old photos we'd found in a dusty drawer. The house creaked, a long, mournful sound, and we shared a glance. This time, I felt it too, the sense that we weren't alone. It was just after midnight when we were jolted awake by a noise that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the tapping this time. It was a thud, heavy and deliberate, like something large had fallen. I threw off the covers and hurried into the hallway, Ellen close behind me. The sound had come from Michael's room. "Dad?" His voice was small and shaky when I opened the door. He was sitting up in bed, the glow of his nightlight casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. Abby stood in the doorway, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. "Did you hear it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, sweetheart. It was probably just something falling in the attic," I said, though the doubt in my voice was palpable. "Can we check?" Michael's eyes were wide, and I couldn't say no. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and made my way to the narrow door at the end of the hall, the door to the attic. I had avoided it during our unpacking, mainly because the thought of crawling into a dark, cobweb-strewn space didn't appeal to me. The door creaked open, and the smell of dust and mothballs flooded my senses. I shined the flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through layers of shadow. There was nothing, just old boxes, forgotten furniture, and insulation. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "See? Nothing here," I said, turning to Michael and Abby. But just as the words left my mouth, the tapping began again. This time, it was right above us, sharp and insistent. Ellen's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. The kids huddled close, their eyes wide with fear. The tapping was joined by another sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I couldn't make out any words, but it sent a chill down my spine. "We're going back to bed," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We shut the attic door, the tapping ceasing the moment it clicked shut. Ellen and I exchanged a glance, one that spoke volumes. Something was wrong with this house, and we were only beginning to find out just how deep the oddities ran. The days that followed the tapping incident were tense, though we all tried to mask it with forced smiles and laughter. During the day, the house seemed harmless enough. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced lazily in the air. The kids continued to explore every nook and cranny, their giggles echoing off the high ceilings, and Ellen busied herself with decorating, determined to make the house feel like home. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in shadow, the atmosphere shifted. It started with the footsteps. They were faint at first, just the soft creak of floorboards overhead when we were all on the main floor. Ellen noticed them one night while we were watching TV in the living room. The old chandelier above us swayed gently, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Did you hear that?" Ellen whispered, her voice tight. I muted the television, and we both sat in silence, straining to catch the sound again. There it was, a slow, deliberate series of steps, moving from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other. I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to my ears. "Probably just the house settling," I said, echoing the refrain I'd used so often it felt rehearsed. But deep down, a cold, nagging doubt had taken root. Michael and Abby, oblivious to our unease, were playing in the corner with a puzzle. The living room, with its heavy velvet curtains and antique furniture, felt suddenly too cramped. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and every shadow seemed to stretch and shift when I wasn't looking. Then, one evening, the strange happenings took a turn that was impossible to ignore. Ellen and I were woken in the middle of the night by a loud bang. It came from downstairs, a sharp, jarring noise that shattered the silence. "Stay here," I whispered to Ellen, though she clutched the blanket tightly, her knuckles white. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed, a relic of college days, and crept down the staircase, my heart thundering in my chest. Each step creaked beneath my weight, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. The living room was dark, save for the pale sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. I flicked the light switch, and the chandelier blinked to life, casting its warm glow across the room. Everything was as we had left it, except for one thing: the antique mirror above the fireplace. It had cracked down the middle, the jagged line splitting the glass like a sinister grin. Ellen's voice called out from upstairs, quivering. "What is it?" I swallowed hard, forcing calm into my voice. "Just a broken mirror," I said, but the words felt wrong. Mirrors didn't shatter on their own. The next morning, I called a handyman to inspect the house. He was an older man named George, with weathered hands and eyes that had seen more than a lifetime's worth of stories. He took one look at the mirror and frowned. "Strange," he muttered. "Looks like something hit it from the inside." My stomach turned. Ellen stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes darting nervously between George and the mirror. "Is there any structural issue that could have caused it?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. George shook his head slowly. "Nothing that would do this," he said, glancing up at the ceiling. "This house, well, some places just have stories, you know." The following nights brought more disturbances. Objects moved when no one was around, a chair that shifted a few inches to the left, picture frames tilted as though a passing hand had brushed them. Michael mentioned that his toy car, which he always left on the floor, would sometimes be on his bed when he woke up. "Maybe you're sleepwalking, buddy," I suggested, trying to sound playful. But the tightness in my chest grew worse each time something inexplicable happened. One particularly cold night, I woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, barely more than a murmur, but it was unmistakable. I lay still, listening, my ears straining in the dark. The sound seemed to come from the hallway just outside our room. I reached out and shook Ellen awake. "Do you hear that?" She sat up, eyes wide, and nodded. The whispering grew louder, but we couldn't make out the words. It was as if two people were having a conversation in hushed, urgent tones. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. "We need to check," I whispered, though my body screamed to stay put. Ellen squeezed my arm, her hand cold. We stepped into the hallway, the floor groaning underfoot. The air was colder there, with an almost electric stillness. I flicked on the hall light, half expecting to see someone standing at the end of the corridor, but it was empty. The whispering didn't return that night, but neither of us slept until morning. Over the next week, Ellen and I started noticing changes in Michael and Abby. They were quieter, more withdrawn. Michael, usually full of questions, now stared blankly at the walls, as if seeing something we couldn't. Abby, only 6 years old, clung to her mother's side and refused to go to her room alone. "I heard a voice," she whispered one day, her big eyes looking up at me with a seriousness that made my throat tighten. It said my name. I exchanged a look with Ellen, who was already pale. We couldn't keep brushing this off. Something was happening in the house, something beyond our understanding. Driven by a mix of fear and determination, I began searching for answers. I scoured old town records, digging into the history of the house. It turned out that the house on Oak Hollow Road was more than just an architectural relic. It had belonged to the Whitmore family in the early 1900s. They had lived there for years before the entire family, parents and 3 children, mysteriously vanished. The house had changed hands a few times afterward, but each owner had moved out after only a short stay, and it eventually fell into disrepair. The more I learned, the more the strange occurrences made a twisted kind of sense. We weren't just dealing with an old house and its creaks, we were living in the echoes of its haunted past. The night that changed everything began with an unsettling stillness that blanketed the house. The rain outside had stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that pressed against the walls. It was nearly 2 o'clock, and the quiet felt different, not peaceful, but expectant, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I woke suddenly, my body tense, every nerve on high alert. The hairs on my arms stood up as a shiver ran down my spine. Ellen stirred next to me, sensing the shift in the room. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, barely audible. I nodded, unable to speak. The sound that had pulled me from sleep came again, a low, mournful groan, echoing up from somewhere deep within the house. It reverberated through the air, setting my teeth on edge. It was as if the house itself was moaning. "Stay here," I whispered to Ellen, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I reached under the bed for the baseball bat, its wooden surface cold and reassuring in my grip. Each step down the hallway felt heavier than the last, the creaks of the old floorboards protest under my weight. The hallway seemed longer than usual, as if stretching out in front of me in some nightmarish distortion. Shadows clung to the walls, flickering and dancing as I passed. When I reached the top of the staircase, I stopped. The living room below was dark, illuminated only by a sliver of moonlight that filtered through the rain-streaked window. And then I saw a figure standing near the old mahogany dining table. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was faint, almost transparent, but undeniably there. A man, or what used to be one, stood motionless, his form shimmering as if caught between reality and a dream. His eyes were hollow voids, deep and dark, yet somehow they seemed aware. They locked onto me, and an unnatural cold spread through my limbs. Before I could move or react, the figure raised one hand. It was skeletal, the fingers elongated, curled as if in a silent command. And then, with a voice that seemed to come from every corner of the room at once, he spoke. "Leave," it whispered. The word stretched and ragged, sending a jolt of pure terror down my spine. The voice carried an age-old bitterness, like an echo from beyond time. It felt as though the walls themselves were hissing. Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice barely louder than a breath. The figure tilted its head slightly, the movement so slow it was almost unnatural. "Leave now," it repeated, louder this time, and the air around me seemed to crackle with energy. A sudden gust of cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the few candles we kept lit for comfort. The darkness that followed was absolute. Behind me, I heard Ellen call my name, her voice shaking with fear. I turned, stumbling back up the stairs to find her standing in the doorway, eyes wide with terror. Michael and Abby were huddled behind her, their faces pale. "What's happening?" Ellen's voice cracked as she spoke. I had no answer, only the burning urge to get my family out of that house. We need to go. Now, I said, grabbing her hand and urging the kids to follow. But just as we moved to descend the stairs, the groaning sound erupted again, louder, shaking the floor beneath our feet. The chandelier in the hallway swayed wildly, its crystal pieces clinking together like frantic whispers. Suddenly, the door to the living room slammed shut with such force that it sent a vibration up through the walls. The sound echoed through the halls, followed by silence that felt like it would swallow us whole. Run, I shouted, my voice raw with panic. We bolted down the stairs, the children's sobs mixing with the sound of our pounding footsteps. As we reached the front door, it swung open on its own, the night air outside a welcome rush against my fevered skin. Once outside, we didn't stop. We ran to the car, piled in, and I turned the ignition with shaking hands. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back at the house. In the window, where the moonlight cast its glow, the figure stood watching, unmoving. His empty eyes followed us as we drove away, leaving behind the home that had once promised a fresh start, but had delivered only nightmares. The whisper hung in the air, almost tangible, freezing me in place. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out every rational thought. In the corner of my eye, I saw Ellen's shadow approach at the top of the stairs. What's happening? She called softly, her voice quivering. Get back, I managed, my voice strained and hoarse. But before she could respond, the figure flickered, then seemed to dissolve into the shadows as though pulled away by some unseen force. The room fell silent again, the chill dissipating as quickly as it had come. Ellen took tentative steps down the stairs, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief. We stood in the middle of the living room, the echoes of that command still ringing in our ears. We need to leave. Now, I said, the urgency in my voice undeniable. Without a word, Ellen nodded, and we hurried back upstairs, grabbing only our essentials, wallets, phones, and car keys. The house creaked as if watching us, each groan of the old wood a reminder that it was alive, aware. The drive away from the house was silent, punctuated only by the occasional sniffle from Ellen as she fought back tears. I kept my eyes on the road, but in the rearview mirror, the silhouette of the house loomed like a dark figure, indifferent to our hasty departure. The streetlights threw harsh, orange glows across the pavement, but nothing felt safe, nothing felt real. We stayed at a nearby hotel that night, the sterile, impersonal surroundings offering some semblance of normalcy. It wasn't until dawn began to break, streaking the sky with pale gray light, that I felt the tightness in my chest begin to loosen. Ellen sat at the edge of the bed, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the wall as though it held the answers we so desperately sought. What was it? She whispered finally, her voice cracking. I shook my head, the words refusing to form. How could I explain something that defied every logical explanation? The memory of that figure, its hollow eyes and skeletal hand, burned in my mind. The command it gave us resonated in my bones. Over the next few days, we spoke to neighbors, local historians, anyone who might know more about the house. We discovered it had a dark past and unsolved disappearance from decades ago. A young woman, whose name had faded from the town's collective memory, had lived there before vanishing one night without a trace. The case had left the town uneasy, but as the years went by, it became just another story passed around campfires and schoolyards. One elderly man we spoke to, Mr. Hendricks, recalled details others had forgotten or perhaps chosen to ignore. He told us about the woman's frequent whispers about a presence she felt in the house, an unseen force that seemed to watch and follow her. She was convinced something lived there, he said, his voice thick with the weight of memory. And one day, she was just gone. Ellen's hand gripped mine tightly as Mr. Hendricks spoke. Every word felt like it peeled away the normalcy we had tried so desperately to reclaim. The reality was clear. Staying in that house was not an option. We returned only once during daylight to gather our belongings. The air inside felt stagnant, heavy, as if holding its breath. Every creak and shadow made our movements frantic, uncoordinated. We packed as quickly as we could, refusing to meet each other's eyes, too afraid of what we might see reflected there. By the time we left for good, the sun had dipped behind the trees, casting long claw-like shadows across the yard. As I turned the key in the lock for the last time, I felt a strange mix of relief and loss, as though leaving the house meant abandoning unanswered questions, leaving them to be swallowed by the darkness within. We found a small apartment in town, a place that buzzed with life and laughter, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the old house. But even there, traces of that night lingered. The creak of a floorboard, the sudden chill of a draft, they would send our hearts racing, a silent reminder that some things don't stay confined to four walls. It's been months now. Life has settled into a new kind of normal. Ellen and I speak about that night sparingly, as if giving it words might bring it back to life. The house has been put back on the market. The for sale sign a stark declaration that the past is up for grabs, waiting for another unsuspecting soul. I find myself thinking about the command we heard, leave. Was it a warning? A plea? Or something more sinister? The ambiguity gnaws at me during quiet moments when the hum of the world is dulled and I'm left alone with my thoughts. Some nights, I wake up in the small hours, the memory of cold fingers brushing my arm. I look over to see Ellen, eyes shut, brow furrowed, even in sleep. It's then I understand that whatever we encountered didn't just haunt that house, it clung to us, whispering across the boundary of memory. We've moved on, yes, but the house still holds a piece of us, an invisible tether stretching between the present and that night when time itself seemed to stop. And though we're no longer there, a part of me wonders if, in some way, we never truly left. I've always been someone who enjoys the peace of the outdoors. The woods have a calming effect, a sense of serenity that most people tend to overlook. Maybe it's the rustle of leaves in the wind or the crisp air that smells faintly of pine and earth. There's something about being away from the noise of the city that brings a kind of clarity, like the world slows down just enough to catch your breath. And that's exactly what I was seeking when my friends and I decided to rent a cottage for a weekend getaway. This wasn't just any cabin though, it was tucked deep into the woods, miles away from the nearest town, far enough to feel like we were alone in our own little world. There was no electricity, no cell phone service, just a wood-burning stove, a few oil lamps, and a stack of board games. The kind of place that promised an escape from the chaos of life. For the past few months, I'd been stressed out, work was overwhelming, and the usual daily grind had left me feeling drained. So, when my best friend suggested a quiet weekend in the country, I didn't hesitate for a second. It seemed like the perfect way to recharge. The group of us was small, just 4 close friends. We were all in our late 20s, familiar with each other's quirks and habits. There was me, of course, the one who always had a skeptical view of anything that couldn't be explained rationally. Then there was Jake, the eternal optimist, always excited about new adventures. Mark was the quiet one, often lost in his thoughts, but loyal to the core. And then there was Lisa, the one who would never let anything pass without asking a million questions, an analytical mind that always needed to figure things out. We drove up to the cottage on a Friday evening, just as the sun was setting behind the tree line, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The drive had been longer than we expected, especially with the winding roads and the deepening darkness, but eventually we arrived. The cottage looked like something from a postcard, charming, with its ivy-covered walls, wooden shutters, and a stone chimney puffing out a thin trail of smoke. The kind of place that makes you feel at home immediately. We unpacked our things, settled into our rooms, and started a fire in the living room. The night was crisp, and the warmth of the flames made the air in the cottage feel even more inviting. There was something comforting about being away from the noise of the world, surrounded only by the sounds of the crackling fire and the occasional chirping of insects outside. It felt like we were in our own little bubble of peace. After a long day of traveling, we were content to relax. We spent the evening playing cards and chatting, laughing over silly jokes, and eating too much junk food. It was the kind of simple, carefree night that was perfect for unwinding. The woods outside, though dark and shadowy, seemed harmless, as though we were completely alone in the world. We didn't think about the silence beyond the walls, or the way the trees moved with the wind, creating strange patterns in the moonlight. For all we knew, the night would pass like any other, and we'd wake up the next morning feeling refreshed and ready to take on whatever the weekend had in store. But as the night wore on, something began to feel a little off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first. Just small things subtle enough that you might dismiss them if you weren't paying attention. The shadows outside the windows seemed to move in ways that didn't make sense. I caught myself staring at the flickering candlelight, noticing how it seemed to bend at odd angles, as if something was influencing the air around it. I told myself it was just the draft from the fireplace, but the feeling lingered. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, we finally decided to call it a night. Lisa and Jake went to their room upstairs, and Mark and I stayed behind, sitting by the fire for a little while longer. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease, as if something was watching us. But I shook it off, attributing it to the isolation of the cottage being so far from civilization can do that to a person. We all went to bed soon after, and the world seemed to grow quieter. The usual sounds of the night, rustling leaves, distant animal calls had faded into an almost unnatural stillness. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, though the sky was clear. It wasn't long before I drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, a sense of dread creeping over me. The house was eerily silent, except for the occasional crack of wood settling. I lay still for a moment, my eyes wide open in the dark, straining to listen. The noise had been faint but unmistakable, a soft thud, followed by a rustle coming from downstairs. I tried to brush it off as just the house settling, but then there was another noise. This time, it was clearer. A scraping sound, like something or someone was dragging across the wooden floor below. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, hoping it was just my imagination. But it wasn't. I sat up in bed, listening intently, my ears straining in the darkness. The sound came again, closer this time. The unmistakable noise of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. I wasn't alone. The next morning, I tried to shake off the lingering unease that had settled in my mind during the night. It was likely just the quiet of the cottage, the unfamiliarity of the woods, and the odd noises that come with any old house. It didn't help that I had woken up late after that restless sleep, feeling the weight of a night that hadn't been quite as peaceful as I'd hoped. But when I glanced around at my friends, I didn't see any signs of distress. Jake was already up, grinning as he cracked open a window and took in the fresh morning air. Lisa and Mark were in the kitchen, laughing about something, setting up for breakfast. It seemed like just another ordinary morning. But even as the sun filtered in through the windows, casting a warm glow across the rustic wooden beams of the cottage, something still gnawed at me. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, like it was waiting for something to happen. I shook off the feeling and joined my friends in the kitchen, where the smell of coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. The day was bright and promising, and if anything, I was eager to put the strange noises from the night behind me. "So, what's the plan for today?" Lisa asked, looking over her shoulder as she flipped the pancakes. She was trying to sound cheerful, but I could tell there was a slight tension in her voice. Jake, ever the optimist, grinned and gave a half shrug. "I say we head out for a hike and explore the woods. Maybe find a stream or something." Mark didn't seem particularly eager for a hike, but he was quiet as always. He nodded in agreement, his eyes a bit distant as he stirred his coffee. I couldn't help but notice that, like me, he hadn't been able to shake the strange feeling from last night. "I think that's a good idea," I said, trying to sound more enthusiastic than I felt. "We can get some fresh air, maybe clear our heads." After breakfast, we bundled up and headed out into the woods. The air was crisp, but it was beautiful out there, silent, aside from the sound of our footsteps crunching the fallen leaves beneath our boots. It felt good to be outside, surrounded by the towering trees and the feeling of being completely cut off from the outside world. The tension from the night before seemed to dissipate as we walked further into the woods. We wandered for a couple of hours, laughing and chatting as we explored the natural beauty around us. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, something strange happened. We had just stopped by a small clearing when I noticed it's something that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps my imagination playing tricks on me after the strange noises of the previous night. But as I focused on it, I couldn't deny what I was seeing, a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man. He was standing so still that at first I thought he was a shadow or part of the woods. He was wearing a dark coat, the collar turned up against the wind, and his face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. His hands were clasped in front of him, and he stood there, motionless, as if watching us. "Do you guys see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, unsure if I was imagining it. Jake followed my gaze and stopped in his tracks. Lisa and Mark also turned, their expressions instantly shifting to confusion. "Who's that?" Lisa asked, her voice sharp with concern. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding a little faster. "But he's just standing there." We all stood frozen, staring at the figure. He hadn't moved an inch. It wasn't like he was trying to hide. It was as if he didn't care that we could see him at all. There was something unsettling about the way he stood uncomfortably still, like he wasn't really part of this world, like he didn't belong there. "I'm going to go check it out," Jake said suddenly, his usual boldness returning. "Maybe it's just someone from town out for a walk." I shook my head. "Jake, it's too far from town for anyone to just be out here. We're miles from the nearest house." But Jake was already walking toward the figure, undeterred by the warning in my voice. He approached the edge of the clearing, his steps slow and cautious. The figure didn't move. "Hey," Jake called out, his voice louder now, trying to break the silence that had settled around us. "Are you lost?" The figure didn't respond. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, my feet glued to the ground. This wasn't right. I could feel the tension in the air, thickening with every passing second. "Jake, get back here," Mark finally said, his voice a bit shaky. Jake didn't listen. He was still moving toward the figure, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding. Just as Jake reached the spot where the figure had been standing, something strange happened. The man, if that's what he was, began to fade away, like a mist dissolving into the air. I blinked, unsure of what I was seeing, but when I looked again, he was gone. Vanished without a trace. Jake stopped in his tracks, his expression one of disbelief. "Did you see that?" he asked, turning to us. "Where did he go?" Lisa asked, her voice shaking with nervous energy. I don't know," Jake stammered, now looking around the clearing as if expecting the figure to reappear. But there was nothing, just the trees and the quiet hum of the forest. We stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The woods were still, but the tension in the air had returned, and it was thicker than before. My heart was racing, and for the first time, I felt truly unsettled. "We need to go back," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. But before we could make our way back to the cottage, the atmosphere around us seemed to shift. The wind picked up suddenly, swirling around the trees and making the branches creak. I could hear the sound of something brushing against the leaves, like footsteps, but when I turned to look, no one was there. And then there was the sound of twigs snapping, followed by a soft whisper that seemed to come from all directions. My stomach churned. It wasn't just the wind. There was something here. Something that didn't belong. I turned to my friends, my voice now a little more frantic. "Let's go." Now, we started to make our way back to the cottage quickly, but the sense of being watched never left me. Even as we walked, I felt eyes on my back, the feeling of something just out of sight, lurking in the trees. When we finally reached the cottage, the sense of relief I felt was palpable. We didn't speak about the figure in the woods, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The cottage, once so inviting, now felt like a cage, like the walls were closing in on us. The strangeness of the morning hadn't gone away, it had only intensified. We locked the doors behind us, and for the first time, we all stayed inside, unsure of what we might find if we ventured out again. The cottage, once a place of peace, now felt as though it were harboring secrets of its own secrets we weren't meant to uncover. And somewhere, out there in the woods, the figure was still watching. The following days in the cottage felt like a slow descent into madness. It wasn't just the strange incident in the woods that had shaken us. It was the feeling that something was wrong, something we couldn't quite grasp. At first, we tried to tell ourselves that it was just our nerves getting the best of us, that it was easy to overreact to something as innocent as an empty figure in the woods. But with each passing moment, the unease grew. And so did the strange occurrences. We tried to carry on with our days, keeping busy by exploring the area around the cottage. And during the nights, we kept ourselves occupied with games, laughter, and talking. But the atmosphere inside the cottage had shifted. The cozy, homey feel it once had was now replaced with an oppressive weight. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, made us jump. It started with the little things, the odd noises at night, the soft thudding that echoed in the walls, the tapping of what sounded like fingers on glass, the occasional whisper that seemed to come from the corners of the room. We all heard it. It wasn't just me or just Jake. Lisa and Mark had mentioned hearing things too, though no one would say exactly what. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old houses make noises, it's only natural. But when the sounds started repeating, at the same hour every night around 2 in the morning, it became harder to dismiss them. One evening, we were sitting in the living room, playing cards, trying to keep the mood light, when we heard it again. A faint knocking sound. It started soft, as though it was coming from the front door, but it wasn't rhythmic. It was erratic, almost frantic. Mark looked up from his cards, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart starting to race. We all sat in silence, straining to listen. The knocking continued, louder now, coming from somewhere deep inside the house. It wasn't the door. It sounded like it was coming from the walls. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like lead. "Maybe it's the plumbing," I suggested, though I didn't believe it for a second. Old houses have strange pipes. Jake, ever the skeptic, stood up with me. "I'll go check it out," he said, though his voice didn't sound as confident as usual. He walked toward the door, but before he could reach the handle, the sound stopped. Just like that. Complete silence. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "See? It's nothing." But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. Something was happening here. Something that I couldn't explain. The following night, the noises grew even more intense. This time, they didn't just come from the walls. We could hear the unmistakable sound of something moving in the attic above us. It was dragging, like something heavy being scraped across the floor. The whole house seemed to groan under the weight of whatever it was, and I couldn't stop myself from trembling. We gathered in the living room, all of us wide-eyed and silent, listening. "Okay, we need to figure this out," Lisa said, her voice quivering. "We can't just keep ignoring it. This isn't normal." "No kidding," Jake muttered, but there was a sense of unease in his voice that I'd never heard before. Mark looked at us with wide, uncertain eyes. "We should just leave. I don't care how far away the nearest town is. I don't feel right here." But none of us could bring ourselves to leave, not yet. I think we were all too curious, too unsettled to just walk away without answers. The next day, we decided to investigate. Armed with nothing but our nerves and a flashlight, we climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The moment I stepped onto the first stair, I felt a shift in the air, something thick and oppressive, as if the house was holding its breath. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The attic door was old and heavy, but it creaked open easily enough. The air in the attic was stale, thick with dust. We moved cautiously into the room, our footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The beams above us creaked under our weight, and I could feel the temperature drop with every step. There was nothing unusual in the attic, at least, nothing that was immediately visible. But the floorboards had been disturbed. Old crates and boxes had been shifted to one side, and there were fresh marks on the floor, as if something had been dragged across them recently. The air was musty, but there was something else, something faint, like the smell of wet earth, as though the ground beneath the house had been disturbed. "Someone must have been up here," Lisa said, her voice tight. "Maybe the owner left some stuff behind." "Or someone else was here recently," I said, though I didn't know who. The owner of the house had been long gone, and no one had mentioned any recent visitors. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. That someone had been watching us. We began to search the attic, but we found nothing else of note, aside from the strange marks on the floor. We couldn't explain what they were. We couldn't even explain why we felt so wrong being up there. We left quickly, locking the door behind us. But as we descended the stairs, there was an unmistakable sound. A soft thudding, coming from inside the walls again, just like the night before. None of us spoke for a long time. That night, as we sat around the living room, the atmosphere felt different. The air was heavier, thicker, like we were being watched. The house felt alive, and not in a comforting way. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see something or someone standing behind me. As the evening wore on, the tension escalated. We could hear the tapping again. But this time, it wasn't just coming from the walls. It was coming from the floor, from under the floorboards themselves. I tried to ignore it at first, convincing myself it was just my nerves, but then I saw the others. Their faces were pale, eyes wide, as they listened to the same thing I was. The tapping was louder now, more deliberate. It sounded like a message, like something trying to get our attention. "Is it coming from below?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, my throat tight. "I think so. The basement." We didn't speak about it after that. The thought of going into the basement, of facing whatever was lurking under the house, was too much. But deep down, I knew we couldn't just sit here. We had to find out what was happening, no matter what it took. That night, I went to bed early, hoping that sleep might bring some respite. But as I lay there in the dark, I heard it again. The knocking. The strange, rhythmic tapping. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the walls, or the floor, or the attic. The silence in the room was deafening. I lay in bed, heart racing, my body frozen beneath the covers. The tapping beneath my bed had stopped, but the air around me was thick, heavy, suffocating. My eyes darted around the room, searching the darkness for any sign of movement, any sign that I wasn't alone. I heard it again, a faint whisper, so quiet I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. My name, soft and slow, drawn out like a sigh. "Ella." I held my breath, my mind screaming to get up, to run, but my body refused to cooperate. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls stretching and compressing like they were alive. My hands were clammy, my fingers clenching the edge of the blanket as if holding on to something familiar would anchor me in reality. Then, without warning, the sound came again, the unmistakable tapping, this time directly under my bed. It was like fingers were tapping on wood, light and rapid, as if they were waiting for me to respond. But how? What could I do? I turned to look at the others. Mark and Lisa were still in the living room, their voices muffled, though I could hear the urgency in their tone. Jake was there too, sitting on the old sofa, his hand gripping the armrest so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. We had all heard the strange sounds by now, but tonight, something felt different. It felt more real. The pressure in the air was overwhelming, as if the very house was holding its breath. I slowly slid out of bed, careful not to make a sound. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to scream, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed by the terror that had taken hold. I crept to the door, glancing back one last time at the empty, shadowed corner of the room. The tapping was louder now, and the air felt colder. I opened the door as quietly as I could and stepped into the hallway. But the moment my foot hit the floor, the sound stopped abruptly, as if it had never been there at all. I turned, my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to call out to the others, to tell them what had happened, but the words caught in my throat. I could barely make sense of what was happening myself. I walked down the hall, toward the living room, where the others were. Mark, Lisa, and Jake were huddled together, whispering frantically. Their voices broke the tension in the air for just a moment, but the fear in their eyes said everything. They had heard the same things. They knew something was wrong. "Ella, what happened?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. "I don't know," I muttered. "I heard something. It was under the bed." Mark's face went pale. "Under the bed?" I nodded, my heart still thumping loudly in my chest. I don't know what it was, but it was real. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. Something was in the room with me. We all fell into an uneasy silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, each of us trying to process what had just happened. But then we heard it again. This time, it wasn't just tapping. It was a voice, low and guttural, coming from deep within the walls of the house. "Get out." It was barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. We all froze, looking at one another, eyes wide with shock. That voice, there was no mistaking it. It had come from inside the house, inside the walls. Without thinking, we rushed toward the source of the sound, the basement door, the only place in the house we hadn't fully explored. We didn't talk, didn't ask each other if this was the right thing to do. There was no time for discussion. The fear that had been building inside of us had reached its peak, and all we wanted was to know what was happening. We had to know. Mark reached the door first, his hand trembling as he grasped the handle. The basement was cold, much colder than the rest of the house. I could feel the chill seeping into my bones as he slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, and we were hit by the smell of earth and something else, something rancid, like decay. Lisa gasped and stepped back, her hand covering her mouth. "We shouldn't go down there," she whispered, her voice shaking. But there was no turning back now. We had come this far, and whatever it was that had been haunting us, whatever it was that had been tapping, whispering, and making its presence known, it was down there, waiting. We descended the stairs one by one, the wooden steps groaning under our weight. The further we went down, the colder it became. The walls seemed to close in around us, the darkness so thick I could almost taste it. We had our flashlights, but the light from the beams barely cut through the shadows, leaving us with only fleeting glimpses of the basement. It was a small room, cramped with old boxes and forgotten furniture. The air was thick with dust and something else, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. We moved further into the space, our footsteps muffled by the thick layers of dust on the floor. And then we saw it. In the far corner of the basement, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It wasn't fully formed, but it was there, just a shape, an outline, like a person made of smoke. It was tall, its features indistinguishable, but I could feel its presence, its weight. The temperature in the room plummeted, and my breath came out in ragged bursts as I stared at the figure. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching us. And then it spoke. "Leave. Now." The voice was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was low, but it was distorted, as though it was coming from somewhere far away, as though it wasn't entirely human. I felt my legs give out beneath me. The room spun, and I had to grab onto the wall just to keep myself standing. My breath was coming in shallow gasps, my chest tightening. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. Jake, ever the one to try to take control, stepped forward, his voice cracking. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want from us?" The figure remained silent, but I could feel it. Its presence was almost suffocating. It didn't need to speak. We all knew, deep down, what it was. This was not some prank, some trick of the light. This was real. Get out, the voice repeated, its tone more urgent now, as if it was warning us. Without another word, we turned and fled up the stairs. I couldn't stop running, my heart pounding in my chest as I stumbled through the basement door, slamming it shut behind me. We didn't stop until we were back in the living room, gasping for air, our bodies trembling. I looked at the others, but they looked just as lost, just as terrified. None of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. It was Jake who finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse. That wasn't human. That was something else. We all knew he was right. Whatever that thing was, whatever was haunting this place, it wasn't just a simple ghost. It was something far worse. Something old and angry, something that didn't want us here. And in that moment, we all understood the same thing. We had to leave. There was no staying here, no trying to figure it out. Whatever this was, it would not stop until we were gone. But as we rushed to pack our things, the house seemed to come alive around us. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned, and the temperature dropped even further. Whatever was in the house didn't want us to leave. It was closing in on us, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. In the back of my mind, I kept hearing that voice, that whisper, "Leave. Now." And as we ran out the door into the cold night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped, that whatever it was, whatever was watching us from the shadows, was still out there, waiting. We left. That's the only thing that mattered. We didn't stop to grab anything more than our phones and jackets. The rest of our belongings, the things we thought we'd have time to pack, the items we had planned to take home and use, stayed behind. The weight of the house that had once seemed so quaint, now felt like a prison. We ran. The car was parked just a few feet from the front door, but it felt like miles. The driveway seemed endless, as though the earth itself didn't want us to escape. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the leaves felt like the house was reaching out to drag us back in. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see that figure standing in the window, watching us with those empty, hollow eyes. But nothing. Just the dark shape of the house standing against the night sky. Silent. Watching. Waiting. We piled into the car without saying a word. The engine roared to life, and we peeled out of the driveway, the wheels spinning as we left the cottage and the terror behind. But it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a brief reprieve. We didn't talk on the drive home. None of us could find the words. What was there to say? How could any of us begin to explain what had happened? The air in the car felt thick with the weight of it, all those strange voices, the feeling of being watched, the terrifying figure in the basement. The more I thought about it, the less real it seemed. How could something like that be real? I looked over at Mark, who was driving with a tight grip on the wheel, his knuckles pale. He hadn't said a word since we left, and I could tell he was just as shaken as the rest of us. I caught his eye for a brief moment, and he gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod, as if to acknowledge that we had all experienced the same thing. We drove for hours, and the miles seemed to stretch on forever. It was as if we were trying to outrun the nightmare that had followed us home. But no matter how far we drove, it didn't feel like we were truly free from the hold the cottage had on us. The figure, the voice that haunted my every thought. We finally reached Mark's apartment, and as we pulled into the parking lot, the weight in my chest didn't lessen. The familiar surroundings didn't bring any comfort. It wasn't home, not really, not anymore. Inside, we dropped our things onto the floor, and we all collapsed onto the couch. But the silence in the room was different now. It was heavy, oppressive. We couldn't even look at each other, as though acknowledging what had happened would make it real in a way we weren't ready to face. "I don't know what we saw," Mark finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse, as though the terror had drained all the energy from him. "But I know it wasn't just a ghost. It was something else. Something evil." We all nodded in agreement. No one dared argue. "I'm just glad we're out of there," Lisa whispered, her eyes wide, her hands trembling. "But why? Why us?" None of us had an answer. The houses had been silent for years, decades, maybe. No one had warned us. No one had given us any indication that the place was anything other than an old, forgotten cottage in the woods. But it wasn't just any house. It was something else. Something older, something darker. And we had awoken it. I sat in the quiet, feeling like an intruder in my own skin. The fear was still there, lingering like a shadow. I couldn't escape the images in my mind, the tapping, the whispers, the figure in the basement. The way the air had felt thick and alive, suffocating me with each breath I took. My mind kept returning to that moment when the voice had spoken. Leave now. It had been a warning, a threat, and we hadn't listened. What do you think it wants? I finally asked, my voice trembling. Jake shifted uncomfortably on the couch, his fingers rubbing his temples, as though trying to erase the images from his mind. I don't know. It felt like it was tied to that house. But why us? Why did it choose to come after us? I couldn't answer him. I wanted to, but the words felt empty. There was no logic, no explanation that could make sense of it. The house had called to us, and we had answered. And now, whatever had been living there was awake, restless, and angry. The more I thought about it, the more the question gnawed at me. Was it a curse? A spirit? Some ancient entity? We hadn't seen enough to know. We hadn't investigated far enough. But then again, part of me was glad we hadn't. Some things are better left unexplored. I don't think it's over, Lisa said softly, her voice shaky. I don't think it's going to let us go that easily. I could hear the fear in her voice, and I felt it too. The house had gotten to us, and I wasn't sure if we would ever truly be free of it. The figure in the basement, the voice in the walls, it was all too much to process. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to sleep without hearing those whispers again. As the hours dragged on, the unease in the room grew. We tried to watch TV, tried to distract ourselves, but the images kept coming back, the figure in the corner, the whispers, the cold, and the silence. That endless, suffocating silence. I went to bed that night, but sleep didn't come easily. The darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The voice, that low, guttural whisper, echoed in my mind, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing in the basement. But when I woke the next morning, it was as if nothing had happened. The sun was shining, the world was quiet, and the normalcy of it all felt jarring. How could everything look so peaceful when what we had experienced felt so real? It was as though the house itself had left a scar on my mind, something I couldn't undo, no matter how hard I tried to forget. I went outside, trying to clear my head, but the memories followed me. It wasn't just the cottage I had to escape from, it was what it had left behind. The fear, the unanswered questions, the gnawing feeling that we hadn't really escaped. In the days that followed, we tried to go back to our normal lives. We returned to work, to school, to our regular routines, but everything felt different. Every creak of a door, every flicker of light, every whisper of wind, it all reminded me of that house. Of the figure in the basement, of the voice that had called to us. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not really. It was just waiting for the right moment to return. It's been months since we left that place, and I still think about it. The house is still there, abandoned, decaying in the woods, but I know we can't go back. The fear, the horror, the realization that something had been waiting for us, it lingers, a constant weight on my shoulders. I don't know if it's truly over. I don't know if we've truly escaped. All I know is that the house is still there, watching, waiting. And I don't think we're the only ones who can hear the whispers. But for now, we live on, haunted not by what we saw, but by the things we'll never understand. And maybe that's the worst part of all. It's strange, isn't it? How you can think you've escaped something, only to realize that you never truly left it behind. The cottage, the whispers, the figure, it's all still there in the back of my mind. No matter how much time passes, no matter how far I run, I can still feel it lurking, waiting. You may wonder why I'm telling you all of this. Maybe you're sitting there, wondering if I'm just telling a story for the sake of entertainment. But I want you to understand something. This isn't just a story. It's a warning. Because that house is still out there. It might seem like a harmless cottage at first, just a relic of the past, tucked away in the woods. It might seem like a place you could visit on a quiet weekend, a getaway from the world. But if you were to go there, if you were to let curiosity pull you in like we did, I can promise you that you'll find something much darker waiting for you. Something that doesn't want you to leave. And that's the problem, isn't it? We all think we're safe. We think that just because we've never experienced something supernatural, something terrifying, it means we're immune to it. We hear these stories and think, that's just a legend. That's just something someone made up. But what if it's not? What if all those things you've heard, the stories about haunted houses, the rumors about strange happenings in the woods are true? What if, just like us, you find yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time? I'll be honest, I can't say for sure what we encountered. Maybe it was a spirit, an entity, or something far worse. Maybe it was the house itself, a place that had been waiting to feed off the energy of the living. But whatever it wasn't something I ever want to face again. I wish I could give you answers. I wish I could tell you how to avoid places like that, how to know when you're standing at the threshold of something you don't understand. But the truth is, you can't always tell. Sometimes the darkness is subtle. It's just a feeling, a chill in the air, a shadow moving in the corner of your eye. It's easy to dismiss, to brush off as your imagination playing tricks on you. But that's how it starts, small, unnoticed. When we left the cottage, we thought we were done. We thought that we could go back to our lives, forget the terror we'd faced, and put it behind us. But you don't forget something like that. Not really. It becomes a part of you. And the worst part is that it's always there, lingering in the corners of your mind, creeping back when you least expect it. I still hear the whispers sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows feel just a little too long, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and for a split second, I'll swear I'm back there in that cottage, standing at the foot of the stairs, the figure looming in the dark. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but I can't shake the feeling that something followed us home that night. And that's the thing. There's no closure, no clean resolution, no neat little bow to tie up the end of this story. We didn't get an explanation, and maybe we never will. The house is still out there, and maybe, just maybe, there are others like it, places that aren't quite right, places that draw you in with the promise of peace and quiet, only to trap you in something much worse. So what do you do with that? What do you do with the knowledge that some places, some things, are better left alone? Do you walk through life with one eye constantly on the lookout for signs, always wondering if you're about to cross the line into something you can't come back from? Or do you forget about it, push it aside, and go on as if everything is normal, as if the shadows are just shadows, and the whispers are just the wind? I don't know, but I do know this. If you ever find yourself near an old house, especially one in the woods, be careful. Because you don't always know what's hidden inside. You don't always know what's waiting for you in the dark corners of the world. And even if you think you're just going to have a quiet weekend getaway, that cottage in the woods might just be the beginning of something much more terrifying. So, to all of you who are still listening, who are still with me in this moment, remember, don't let your curiosity be your downfall. Sometimes it's better to walk away and leave the mysteries of the world unsolved. Trust me when I say, not all answers are worth finding. And some things, some places are better left in the dark.